Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. Apologies for those online that we're starting a few minutes late, but I promise we've got good stuff ahead. Thanks so much to everybody who's joining us today, either in person or online. My name is Garrett Homry, Research Director here at Duke Margolis Institute for Health Policy. As those of you joining know, today's hybrid workshop is on generic drug repurposing, exploring the potential role of the regulator and associated policy solutions. This work is a 15-month grant that we're about 9 or 10 months into our work on, funded by Arnold Ventures. Happy to have some Arnold Ventures folks in the room today. The workshop will consist of 4 sessions, each of them having presentations and moderated discussions covering a variety of proposed solutions aiming to address the challenges with generic drug repurposing. Again, the specific lens today is on the potential role of the regulator and FDA. I say that specific lens because you'll hear about a lot of other ongoing work, both folks in the room, folks online, and also at Duke Margolis on the topic. So it'll bleed into a bunch of other things. It includes identifying drug repurposing opportunities, seeking label expansion by non-traditional developers. Beth will talk you through our working definition there, and ensuring drug labels are updated to encourage responsible drug promotion and public health benefit. The discussion today and the draft working paper that was circulated this week, it stems from research conducted over the last, say, 9 months. Process there was essentially our internal project team, primarily Beth Boyer and Mia Williams, doing a desk review of existing research and literature, conducted probably about 20 or so individual interviews and meetings. Again, lots of those folks from the room today are online. And then we also hosted a private expert meeting last November with about 25, 30 folks in the room. So we took those findings, the team developed a framework that you'll see later on today. And we look forward to getting your input on it, refining it, expanding it, improving upon it, and ultimately reaching recommendations. Before we begin, I'm going to talk through a few considerations for our discussion and housekeeping notes. Statement of independence. Those of you that work with Duke Margolis El Paso, where we have the enjoyable opportunity to express our academic independence, and certainly look forward to you all soliciting your opinions, views, etc. Speak your mind. This is meant to be an open and inclusive forum. Also, with all of our meetings, since we do these large stakeholder engagement groups, our antitrust compliance policy, folks will be quite familiar with these things. Don't talk about private confidential information, pricing, anything that should be kept internal to your individual organization. Got plenty of examples here. I don't think it'll be an issue with this particular topic, and certainly with everybody's experience dealing in these kind of open forums. Meeting logistics, you will very often see a QR code come up, and attendees are encouraged to submit questions via Zoom or Slido if you're online. You could also certainly do that in the room too, but we've got microphones that we can pass around. We'd love to hear your voices. And all meeting materials for the workshop are available on our Duke Margolis website, and we'll have some follow-up information, making sure that it's easy to access. Voila, as promised, folks can use their phone to offer questions via Slido. We're monitoring them in the back. Folks online, we will try and incorporate as many questions as possible. And we're also, as moderators, we can ask that whenever you are receiving a question on the iPad from Slido, try and make a mention that it's coming from online so folks know that we really do hear you. And even if we can't get to all online questions, we'll certainly collate them and make sure the participants see the questions that are coming in throughout the day, even if we can't address them all. Agenda, welcome and opening remarks, just about through with that, and then I'll be handing over to my colleague, Beth Boyer. Sorry, I just want to make sure I haven't missed any key aspect while moving on. So Beth will kick off the day with a presentation on our current work and findings to date. Beth has been quite invested in this topic, frankly, long before the Arnold Ventures Research Grant began 9 months ago. She'll talk primarily about research findings today, but also reference some other important work she's been doing. Then our first session will be on identifying potential opportunities for generic drug repurposing. Quite excited for the guests that we have participating there. Take a quick break, come back and get into kind of the wonky regulatory pathways, issues, focusing on non-traditional developers, but things like 505(b)(2), labeling updates, frankly, quite critical stuff if you really want to get over the line. Then we'll break for lunch. Look forward to folks taking advantage of time on breaks and at lunch to kind of have independent conversations, enjoy the opportunity of being here in person. And then we'll kick off the afternoon with session 3 on updating labels with established evidence, encouraging responsible promotion. Think things like Project Renewal, Modern Labeling Act, and all sorts of other kind of historical efforts on labeling updates. Then after another quick break, we'll have our last session of the day. Our last session of the day where, listen, every session is intended to have a good amount of discussion, Q&A, etc. But we'll have that last session of the day to kind of look into what have we missed? What should we really prioritize? Are there things on the framework that we should just put a big X over? And frankly, what can practically be achieved by the folks in this room and online? That will be it for the day. We'll take it from there. Of course.
Thanks, Garrett. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Beth Boyer. As Garrett said, I've been leading our work at Duke Margolis for the past 2 or 3 years now on drug repurposing and exploring different policy solutions. So my goal with this initial presentation I'm going to give right now is to really set the foundation for the day and to make sure we're all level setting, understanding our terminology and kind of the research that's gone into preparing today's discussion. So just to kind of take a step back, at Duke Margolis for like the past few years that I mentioned, we have been engaging with stakeholders on the role of drug repurposing to meet unmet patient needs, and what are the different challenges and policy solutions that we can explore in that area. So this has covered a wide range of different topics. We started off by looking at this from a lens of pandemics. Coming right now with COVID-19, there's some great examples there. And so we dove in to figure out what it would take to create an ecosystem that can respond quickly to a pandemic with a repurposed drug. And then from there, we've also then expanded that ecosystem work of like, oh, how could that actually apply more broadly to other use cases? We've been focusing specifically on generic drug repurposing lately, and we've been collaborating with the University of Chicago's Market Shaping Accelerator to explore incentives that can help address some of the challenges there as well. But then for today, we have the work that, as Garrett mentioned, is funded by Arnold Ventures, where we're really diving into the regulatory policy landscape here and trying to explore what is the role of the regulator, the role of FDA, as it pertains to drug repurposing. So we're hoping to have a really great conversation today in this topic, but just to kind of, wrong way. Just to kind of level set and make sure we have a clear understanding of what we're talking about. I think it's helpful to define some terms up front. I think there's a lot of different terms that get thrown around in this space. So when we're talking about drug repurposing, specifically, we're talking about the process of conducting research on new uses for established drugs on the market. So not products that have not made it onto market yet, that might still be assets on company shelves. That's another topic. We're really focusing on established drugs in the market and finding uses for those. And then we're talking about generic drugs specifically, which is the lens we're using for today's conversation. We're talking about those drugs for which there's no longer any exclusivity, and there can be competitors in the market. Doesn't mean that there already are competitors, but there legally can be. So I think it's also helpful to kind of talk through the advantages of repurposing and why we care so much about this. So just from a drug development perspective, we know developing a new drug is very costly, it involves a lot of risk. It can take a long time. This estimate is 8 to 10 years. There's estimates for longer. But one of the advantages of repurposing is that we can rely on existing safety data for these drugs. They have been used, and there is some real evidence too to show that they are safe in the general population. So then you can usually bypass those earlier stages of development, which shortens the timeline, reduces the costs, and also increases that probability of success a little bit in some of the riskiest stages in the earlier stages of development. Another advantage, we're talking about generic drugs specifically, is that they typically are more affordable than a new drug on the market, which usually comes on at a higher price and tends to already be widely available to patients. However, we know that there's a lot of challenges to generic drug repurposing, which is why we don't see it happening as much as you think you would, given all the advantages I just mentioned. We've categorized these challenges into 4 buckets, and I think the first bucket here, the lack of incentives, is one of the biggest challenges we see. So there's really no incentive for traditional developers to do research in this space, even though overall costs for going through drug repurposing trials, it's going to be cheaper than new development. It still costs a lot of money for trials. There's still risk involved. And when you have the low profit margins on the other end because of low prices of generic drugs, there really is no commercial interest at all in repurposing drugs. Another key challenge is the lack of resources and systemic efforts. There are some efforts. We're going to talk about some of them today, but there is limited efforts currently to support repurposing overall. And what we typically see is that non-traditional developers are the ones who step into this space because of these lack of incentives and resources. And we define non-traditional developers as nonprofit organizations and academics in the space. Basically, any organization that's not a traditional company set up to be able to market and sell the drugs. And while they are able to do the research, they may not be best positioned to make sure that drug is actually reaching patients, whether that's navigating regulatory approval or commercializing and marketing and promoting the drug. So what we often see is that most studies for repurposing drugs tend to rely on off-label use. They're not designed to support label changes. So for today's discussion, although all four of these challenges are really important and we are covering them in our work at Duke Margolis, in today's discussion, we're just going to be focusing on these last three buckets of challenges. On the far left, the lack of incentives, we are exploring this in another project, which I'd be happy to talk to anyone interested in that during one of the breaks. That's our work with the University of Chicago. So happy to talk about that separately. But for today, we're going to really be focusing on exploring solutions to these other three challenges. And so as I mentioned, there are some current efforts to address some of these areas. We're going to hear more about these today in the specific session, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. But when it comes to identifying repurposing opportunities, there are a few programs. There's CureID, there's EveryCure, which has their AI platform they're developing to help identify repurposing opportunities. We're going to hear more about both of these in just a moment. And then on the updating labels, there are some current programs within FDA, including Project Renewal, which is focused on updating oncology drugs that are being used off-label, and also the Modern Labeling Act, which came into law in 2020, but still has not been implemented. But this essentially gives the FDA authority to update drug labels for generic drugs for the reference drug holder no longer is in the market. But there's still a pretty big gap in that other challenge I mentioned about non-traditional developers and the pathway that they have, especially if they are interested in getting that drug on label. So if you're a non-traditional developer right now, you have two options. So one is that you can do the research and then partner with a manufacturer and see if they would be willing to sponsor submission to the regulatory authority and go through the 505(b)(2) pathway to update the label. Unfortunately, there's still a lack of incentive for manufacturers to even do this and work with the non-traditional developers. Sometimes they'll say yes, sometimes no, but there's still a lack of incentive there to invest those resources and time and energy into that. So then the other option, which we see most often, is to rely on off-label use, or maybe try to go for inclusion on treatment guidelines or compendia, which is great, but I think a lot of times off-label use, we see that there are some disadvantages, but there is no straight pathway here for these non-traditional developers to go directly to FDA and try to get a drug on label. And just to kind of quickly highlight some disadvantages we see with relying on off-label use, we really see this as one of the key barriers here is just making sure that it reaches patients. So we often see that when a drug is relying on off-label use, there might be slow or uneven uptake. Providers may have mixed feelings about prescribing the drugs. It really can depend on who your provider is. Also the awareness, there might be limited awareness if it's not being actively promoted for that new use. And there can be liability concerns for providers as well, supply issues, et cetera. So there's a range of different challenges, which is why we think today's conversation is so important about trying to understand how we do get these new uses on the drugs label. We've also, as part of our research, tried to look into efforts that are happening internationally. These same problems exist outside the US as well, and there are some efforts that have been taken in Europe and UK to address some of these challenges. So one example is a stamp pilot, which was run by the EMA. This recently concluded, and I'm looking forward to seeing the report of how the pilot turned out. But essentially, this was aimed to support these non-traditional developers in giving them advice to prepare a robust data package. And the goal of that was that way they would have this data package that was ready to go for when they go to the sponsor to see if they'd be willing to partner with them and go through the regulatory process. Another proposal that's currently underway in the EU pharmaceutical reform is Article 48, which would actually create a pathway for non-traditional developers to go directly to the regulator for areas with unmet need. The UK also has had a repurposing program. Unfortunately, it's recently concluded, but this also had an aim at supporting developing an evidence package for drugs. The NHS would select drugs that they thought would have value, updating the drug label, supported getting the evidence generation for that, and then also basically put out a tender for put a call for tenders for someone to sponsor the drug to be submitted to the regulatory authority. There was one successful example in this model, which was Netsresolve for breast cancer prevention. So it's a shame to see that that program no longer is continuing, but we're keeping an eye on other things that might come out of the UK. And so with all this work we've done exploring the challenges, different solutions, we also, as Garrett mentioned, have engaged a lot with folks in this room and other experts. We had a roundtable in the fall where we kind of got some initial ideas on where there could be some policy solutions to these challenges. And from that, we kind of identified three main categories where we think, particularly with this lens of looking at the role of the regulator, where there is an opportunity for policy efforts. So the one is on exploring opportunities for generic drug repurposing. Another is on approval, particularly for non-traditional developers to find regulatory pathways. And then finally on labeling and updating drug labels to support broad public health benefit of the drug and also responsible promotion. So in each of these categories, you might see this aligns very nicely with our schedule for the day. Within each of these, we have identified a range of different potential solutions. And this is the big fancy framework we have here, which has all those solutions. They're color-coded into the categories you just saw. We've also organized this based on the level of effort we think might be required to implement these different solutions. So starting on the left with things that can build on current processes and programs, where all the way on the far right, we have things that might require some legislative action. We also try to organize based on the approximate level of resources we think might be needed to implement. So really our main goal for today is to get feedback on this framework, what is missing, what maybe should be here, other things that we could refine on here, what should be a priority. Obviously, we can't tackle all of these solutions, so what is the most feasible and promising? So that's what we're really hoping to dive into in a lot of our discussions today. So yeah, as I mentioned, our goal is to really refine those recommendations and identify the best opportunities. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started with our very first session, which is going to look at that first topic of identifying targets for drug repurposing. We have some great presentations lined up to get started, and then we'll have time for discussion, also opportunity using the Slido poll for you to actually vote on which opportunities you think within that category are the most promising or feasible. But to get us started, I'm going to invite Heather Stone from FDA to come up and give us a presentation on Cure ID. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you so much. Absolutely delighted to be here and to have this opportunity not only to discuss Cure ID, but to really discuss the role of the regulator, which is something Leonard Sachs and I have been thinking a lot about for the last decade or so. So Cure ID and the potential to you've had everything memorized, right? So the potential for the regulator to help identify generic drug repurposing opportunities. So similarly, I think it's helpful to begin with definitions because as was mentioned before, everybody and their brother has a different definition of drug repurposing. So for my discussion, I'll be focused on the identification of novel uses of existing drugs, similarly kind of focused on those that are on the market, primarily those that are FDA approved, but not exclusively. We look at things that are approved by EMA, Japan, etc. And this is in contrast to drug repositioning, which would refer to drugs that have made it through substantial development but haven't been approved. So one might ask, well, why is repurposing important to FDA? There are many diseases that lack adequate approved treatment options, and de novo drug development has historically not satisfied all of these medical needs. And so in these situations, we recognize that drug repurposing is an important strategy to potentially identify promising treatments that could help patients. Ideal examples of this include things like rare diseases, which can be difficult to study and where the return on investment may be limited, and infectious diseases and outbreaks where time to traditional drug development is often lacking. So we developed the CureID platform because drug repurposing frequently begins in clinical practice through off-label use when clinicians are faced with challenging diseases that they don't have good treatment options for. However, we recognized from personal experience that these experiences are rarely captured. And because of that, we're unable to determine whether the drugs that are being used off-label are effective, ineffective, or even possibly harmful. So CureID is a wonderful collaboration between FDA and NCATS, part of the NIH, that's been going on since about 2012, thanks to support from many in the room. It's a website as well as a mobile app that was designed to capture treatment experiences of healthcare providers, as well as now patients and their care partners for diseases where we just don't have good treatment options. It essentially serves as a treatment registry, where both FDA and NIH, but also the clinical and patient communities can review efficacy data for repurposed drugs when they are being used for unmet needs. I encourage everyone to go to the website or download the mobile app. The sort of key features of the platform are the ability to share treatment experiences through a simple electronic case reporting form, to explore those that have been shared by others. So the data is made totally openly available in near real time, to try to facilitate community building and exchange of information rapidly. And there's also a treatment discussion forum where people can post questions and try to get access to input from the global clinical as well as patient community. So it's essentially a crowdsourcing platform where we try to get clinician, patient, and caregiver experiences with repurposed drugs reported through the electronic case reporting tool. And we've also explored the potential for automated extraction of drug repurposing data from EHRs. I think there's great potential here, but also a lot of limitations in that particular approach. The objectives of the program are really to identify signals of potentially safe and effective treatments, to identify promising drugs for further study. It's really meant as a hypothesis generation tool. We don't believe that this evidence is going to be confirmatory, but that it can give us a good idea of where we should focus our efforts strategically in terms of further drug development. But we do recognize that, in the absence of other information, this can be an important tool to provide physicians, patients, and their families with information where there may be no FDA-approved drugs available, or those that are available are inadequate. So CureID offers healthcare providers, patients, and care partners a mechanism to rapidly share their treatment experiences with the global clinical community. It collects data in a manner that enables it to be immediately aggregated. So it uses structured terminology and allows it to be put together, and then makes the data openly accessible to everyone for free. All cases are reviewed before public posting, so there is a quality control mechanism to ensure that the content that is being posted is reasonable and would not be harmful. Here's just an example of a case that was reported in CureID to give you a sense of how the information is collected and what kind of data is collected. So you can see here, we're talking about Balamuthia, which is a rare amoebic cause of meningitis and encephalitis. So the organism and the syndrome are stated. Then we go through the patient characteristics. So it was a 51 to 60-year-old male in the US who's white and non-Hispanic, with the brain as the site of the infection. Many different methods of diagnosis were employed to try to find out what was wrong with this patient. And there were many challenges. There was no standard approved therapy for this disease. The patient had failed previous therapy, was heavily subject to drug toxicity issues and prior therapy, and had been questionably compliant. And so in an inpatient setting, nitroxaline, which is a drug that is approved in Europe, was added as a repurposed drug to an otherwise failing regimen, and the patient had a fairly remarkable recovery. And I'll go into this case in a little bit more detail now. I want to highlight this case because it's really been very important for us to understand the kinds of situations in where CureID could potentially have the greatest benefit. And this is really quite an extraordinary example of a generic drug in Europe, at least, that is being used for a totally new indication and is really transforming the treatment landscape, hopefully for that condition. So just very briefly, balamuthia is literally a brain-eating amoeba. Sounds scary, and it is scary. It causes severe meningitis and encephalitis and has historically had a fatality rate of up to 90%. And despite using many drugs in a highly toxic combination, the treatment is really very ineffective historically. So a researcher at UCSF, Joe DeRisi, decided that he was going to find a treatment for this. And so he screened all approved drugs in the US and Europe, internationally, over 2,000 drugs. And rather miraculously, no, okay. Okay, give it a try. So rather miraculously, one drug totally stood out. The rest of the drugs that are currently used are in that bottom left quadrant in blue, and the drug that is being looked at as promising is in the top right quadrant in red. And otherwise, all of the things in green are promising, but are topical, antiseptic, veterinary, et cetera, not going to work. So this was quite exciting, but then the question was, how do you actually get it in a patient? This occurs in like less than 10 cases a year. There have only been 200 cases ever reported. So the likelihood of seeing a patient was not really working. So he published this case and, went about his business and hoped that somebody would read the article, and nothing happened for several years. But then he gave me a call and said, we have a patient who showed up and we need to try to get an emergency IND, and how on earth do we do that? I said, well, I actually have no idea either, but I'll ask Leonard and hopefully somebody will know. So fortunately, Leonard was able to guide me through the process, and the review division was very helpful, but the first patient unfortunately passed away before he was able to get access to the drug. However, in a remarkable series of fateful instances, another patient with balamuthia was seen at UCSF, and his clinician went to the published literature. He was on this failing regimen. They were having to stop all the drugs because his organs were failing. It was quite miserable, and he was not expected to survive. And so this young ID fellow went to the published literature and said, "Is there anything else I can try?" And she stumbled across this paper, this high throughput screening paper from Joe, who ironically had actually done her medical school interview, it turns out, but they hadn't connected on this point. So she decided that she was going to try nitroxylene, and she was able to get the emergency IND. It took quite a while to get the drug from China, so that was a bit of a challenge, but this patient was stable enough that miraculously he lived long enough. And the patient was treated with nitroxylene and showed really a remarkable clinical and radiological improvement, and was ultimately discharged alive. So I'm not a physician, but even I can look at this and say, wow, that looks a lot better on the right than it does on the left, right? So, you can see here, and this is, I think, important, right? Where is the outcome very clear in the case of an anecdotal report? And it's not clear in many cases, but this is one where I think it is fairly intuitive. So here you can see that the patients showed really remarkable improvement. This led to a second case. So apparently, I didn't even know this at the time, but apparently Dr. Spottiswoode was kind enough to acknowledge me in her article, writing up the first patient in EID. And a mother of a small child with balamuthia heard about this and read the article and reached out to everybody involved. And so I got a phone call from her, a voicemail, with her sobbing on the phone, asking for help trying to get this drug for her child. And we were able to do it, and through a wonderful series of collaboration with CDC and the FDA review division and the doctors at UCSF, we were able to get the drug to the child very rapidly, to get like a bridge supply, because she didn't have 45 days to get the drug from China. And so she also had a miraculous improvement. She's now off all of the medications and just celebrated her 9th birthday and is doing beautifully, and has had great clinical and radiologic response as well. Because of how extraordinarily rare and fatal this condition is, the CDC is now recommending nitroxylene for balamuthia as well as for other amoebic infections based on these 2 cases, and it's being examined for others. I will say, it's not a magic bullet. There have been a few other cases where patients have received the treatment and have not survived, and I think it's really important to understand the differences. But Compared to a 90% fatality rate, this has been a big win. So lessons from this experience, the process of translating preclinical findings to the clinic can be challenging and lengthy. It took many years, despite very promising evidence. And this is especially true for rare and rapidly fatal diseases. And in such settings, case reports are important tools to identify potentially effective treatment. Sharing data openly and freely is critical and may allow for rapid dissemination of treatment experiences as well as internal results. It took more than a year to publish the first case, and the second case still has not been published, but both of them are now available in CureID. Building and maintaining connections with all impacted parties is necessary to stimulate engagement. We actually never got the second clinician to enter the case. It was the mother who entered it. But that's fine. She probably had better insight into a lot of the details, frankly, than the clinician did. So, we'll take the information from wherever we can. But the reality is that a lot more is needed. Not enough people are using or sharing their treatment experiences in Cure for it to reach its full potential. And so we'd love to hear your advice about how we can improve that. Just to bring it back to FDA as a whole and sort of, what is FDA's role in all of this? So I actually went to FDA's website because I was trying to figure out, well, how can I frame this in such a way? And it says, the Food and Drug Administration is responsible for protecting public health by ensuring the safety, efficacy, and security of human and veterinary drugs. And it's responsible for helping to speed innovations that make medical products more effective and helping the public get the accurate science-based information they need to use medical products. That to me says CureID. And it says, how do we get these drugs that are generic onto, labeled for new indications so that they can benefit patients. And so we think that, a drug repurposing program for unmet needs is a valuable strategy to help us achieve those goals. In terms of the role that the regulator could play in this, we do have extensive experience, going back many decades in looking at post-marketing surveillance for safety of marketed drugs. It's not traditionally been used as much for efficacy, but modern IT developments really give us a new ability to look at the efficacy of post-marketed drugs. And CureID is an example of the kind of electronic tool that could be used. Challenges moving ahead. There are many. These are just a couple for, spurring thought and discussion. But, how do we encourage submissions to the CureID platform? It's not been heavily successful in that regard. And then importantly, how do we support the study of candidate drugs in RCTs and robust observational studies? As I said in the beginning, it's a great hypothesis generation tool. It's not going to tell us conclusively that a drug works. And so we have to have a system for really studying those products. And then ultimately, how do we support non-traditional drug developers who are likely to be the ones to be doing these studies to have the wherewithal to prepare an NDA for a repurposed generic drug? And with that, I will end. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Heather. If you guys have questions for either of our presenters, feel free to use the Slido for now. We will also be taking questions afterwards. But for now, I'm going to invite David Fagenbaum from Evercure to come up and give a presentation as well. And David, I think Heather was a little out of the frame, so if you could try to stay close. You can pick up the mic if you want to stay close to the podium.
Go to the
Hello,
left.
everyone. Heather took an awesome talk as always. So great to be with everyone today. So I'm going to share about Evercure and the work that we're doing to systematically look across all drugs and all diseases to find additional repurposing opportunities. So just to sort of frame things, many of you all are familiar with this, but there are about 4,000 FDA, EMA, and other stringent regulatory authority approved medicines that are approved for about 4,000 diseases. So the average FDA approved drug is approved for about 1.75 diseases, and the average disease that has an approved drug has about 1.75 drugs approved for it. So we've done a pretty good job of treating the same 4,000 drugs with the same 4,000, or same 4,000 diseases with the same 4,000 drugs. But there's still 14,000 diseases that don't have a single approved therapy. And as you heard from Heather, and you guys are all in the room, we know that many of these 4,000 approved drugs could be used in new ways for those diseases. Now, the vast majority, over 80% of our FDA approved drugs are already generic. And so that's what we're talking about today. These drugs are inexpensive, and there's really no financial motive to find new uses for these medicines. This is very personal for me. I had a horrible rare disease called Castleman disease. I still have a horrible rare disease called Castleman disease, but was able to repurpose a medicine called sirolimus that has been approved and around for decades for organ transplant rejection to save my life. And that was a long journey where I did a series of experiments that led me down the path to think that it might be useful. But it was very much inspired by the fact that people have been doing repurposing for years and years and years. I mentioned the average drug is approved for 1.75 diseases. Drug companies are finding new uses for their medicines. They're studying new uses for the medicines. They just typically only do it while it's on patent, under development. And so we have to fill this gap where there isn't development post patent. There's also amazing examples. Everyone in here will be familiar with Viagra and how it went from being approved, or sorry, studied for heart disease to its very well-known use. But you also may not know, or maybe you do know, that it's used for pulmonary arterial hypertension and helps children that were dying as teenagers due to lack of blood flow to the lungs, and now they can live full lives on Viagra. Another one of my favorite drugs is tocilizumab. This is my dear friend Kazuyo Chizaki. He discovered that interleukin-6 was important in Castleman disease. This is back in the 1980s. He actually was part of the team that discovered interleukin-6, period, the existence of it. Then he discovered it was important in Castleman's, and he went on a journey to develop a drug that could inhibit interleukin-6. And I actually was chatting with him about this recently. He developed this monoclonal antibody against the IL-6 receptor, and he could not get his ethics committee in Japan to agree to allow him to use it in humans. This is back in the late 80s. Monoclonal antibodies were new technologies. And so I heard from one of our colleagues that Kazu gave it to himself to prove that it was safe, first human ever. And when I asked Kazu said, no, I didn't give it to myself. The nurse gave it to me. So Kazu gave it to himself. He didn't die. He shared the data with his ethics committee in Japan, and somehow, instead of putting him in jail, they told him that he was allowed to study tocilizumab in Castleman's patients. It went on to get approval in Japan for Castleman disease. And then he started studying in rheumatoid arthritis. It got approval in Japan for RA. And when it was acquired by a large drug company, they felt Castleman's was too small of an indication to get an approval here in the US. So they began to pursue it for rheumatoid arthritis. And then the story gets really interesting in 2010 when the first patient ever treated with CAR T-cell therapy at Penn, Emily Whitehead, was dying from a cytokine storm that looks very similar to Castleman disease. And her doctor gave her tocilizumab. It saved her life, and in doing so, it really saved the cellular immunotherapy program. If the first pediatric patient had died from CAR T-cell therapy, that program probably would have at least died for a short period of time with it. And then, of course, we're all familiar with tocilizumab and SARS-CoV-2 in the most severe COVID patients. It is utilized in this patient. So a great example of this drug that Kazu developed for Castleman's being used in many more conditions. And then the last one I have on the screen is thalidomide, which Janet knows very well. And many of you all are familiar with, of course, the early horrible problems that came from thalidomide before it was repurposed for leprosy and multiple myeloma. And I don't think anyone would ever connect leprosy and myeloma and say there's something similar, but there's common biological underpinnings between both, so thalidomide can be helpful in both conditions. So these experiences really inspired me on my journey, and also the fact that I've received a lot of chemotherapy early in my course of my fight against Castleman disease, and none of those chemotherapies were made for Castleman's. And so I thought, if those 7 chemotherapies can get me into remission temporarily, maybe there's an 8th drug out there that's made for something else that could also get me into remission. So on that journey, found sirolimus. And here's just a slide showing. So the work I did was serum proteomics to identify the strong mTOR signature in my blood, but I wanted to confirm it in tissue. And so I actually had a lymph node biopsy performed during my last relapse with the hope that if I survived, I would have some tissue to experiment on. And so when I got out of the hospital and I got this mTOR signature, I studied a number of lymph nodes from healthy individuals, from people with a variety of different inflammatory conditions as well, to look for the amount of mTOR activation. mTOR is a really critical pathway for immune activation, and it sort of fit the bill. I thought it could be important in my disease. And so I studied a bunch of lymph nodes, comparator lymph nodes, and brown is positive for mTOR activation. You can see in this normal lymph node, there are certainly some cells that have this particular communication line turned on. That's our control. And then we looked at my lymph node, the exact same experiment. You can see tremendous amount of mTOR activation in my tissue. So had serum proteomics pointing to it, had flow data, and then also had this tissue-based data that really pointed to increased activation of this pathway. And so I began taking mTOR inhibitor sirolimus, and it's now been over 11 years that I've been in remission and doing really well on this drug. And the moment that I started taking that drug, and just within a few days seeing my laboratory values improving, the next thing I started thinking about is, oh my gosh, this drug was always there at my pharmacy. How many more drugs are at the pharmacy that could treat more diseases? You know, if I had died many of the times before that I should have died, we would have never learned about this. How many more of these opportunities are there out there that are just waiting to be uncovered? So I started a center at Penn about 11 years ago, and we've gone on to do this 13 more times. We found a new use for existing medicine. And I'll just highlight a couple of them that I'm really excited about. One of them is a young girl named Kyla, who has Castleman's, the same disease as me, wasn't responding to any therapies, even the one that I just mentioned, sirolimus. And her doctor reached out to me asking if there's anything else we could try. And we just done a large proteomic study. So we measured 1,000 proteins in the blood of about 80 Castleman's patients with flare versus remission. And we were looking for signatures in the blood, just like we did in my case. And we started out by looking at patients who respond well to IL-6 blockade, that drug I mentioned, the cosumate tocilizumab that blocks IL-6. So we know IL-6 is important in Castleman, so we did serum proteomics in patients who get better with an IL-6 blocker. And importantly, we saw that IL-6 STAT3 signaling came up as being enriched, which is a good thing, because we know that IL-6 is the driver in those patients. So this is our positive control. And then we look to see, well, what about people who don't get better in IL-6 blockade? Are there other potential treatments and what pathways could be enriched? And then we were really surprised to see IL-6 JAK-STAT signaling show up again, even in people who don't get better in IL-6 blockade, which is a little puzzling. But then we said, well, maybe the problem isn't IL-6 in those patients, maybe it's downstream of IL-6. And so we stained a bunch of lymph node tissue, and we found, in fact, whether or not you respond to IL-6 blockade, all of these patients have increased STAT3 activation. We did some important experiments in my lab on patient samples that confirmed that there was this hyperactivation related to JAK1/2 and STAT3. And so all of this was coming together actually independently from this patient in Chicago who wasn't responding well, Kyla. As I mentioned earlier, she was in the hospital for about a year. And when her doctor called right around the time that last figure worth of experiments was being completed, I said, well, you could try this JAK inhibitor. We're getting this JAK signature. Ruxolitinib is approved for myelofibrosis, and it's a really potent and effective JAK1/2 inhibitor. Had not been used before for Castleman's. Her doctor tried it, and Kyla responded really well. This is a year ago. She began her freshman year of nursing school at Marquette last fall, and now she's getting ready for a summer where she'll be working on a nursing unit closer to home. So this is another early win for us. Oh, thank you. Another early win where we got really excited, like, oh my gosh, like this drug was always there for myelofibrosis. Now we're using it for Castleman's. What else is out there? And then I'll highlight, these are all patients who are alive today because of repurposed drugs, but I'll share Michael's story. This one really stands out. And actually there's some really good connections to Heather's case that she just shared. And that's that, so Michael came to us in 2016. And I'll also disclose Michael's actually my uncle. So I know Michael very well, but so he was diagnosed with metastatic angiosarcoma in 2016 and failed to respond to early therapy, or not early, the only therapies for metastatic angiosarcoma. And the question was, are there other medications that could be useful for him? And so I did something very simple. I did a Google search and a PubMed search, and I found that there was a paper that was published 3 years earlier in 2013 in PLOS One highlighting out of 5 patients with metastatic angiosarcoma, 4 of the 5 had increased PD-L1 expression. And so, of course, at the time in 2016, we knew that PD-L1 expression was a biomarker, at least within melanoma and also within lung cancer, of responsiveness to PD-1 inhibition. So we asked the question, could using a PD-1 inhibitor work? And I talked to Michael's doctor, and his doctor was pretty adamantly opposed to the idea of using a PD-1 inhibitor because they'd never been used before for angiosarcoma. But his doctor had also just said, we have no more options for you. You're going to die in a couple months. And so we found another doctor, and that other doctor stained for PD-L1 expression, and Michael's tumor came back 99% positive for PD-L1 expression. Started Michael as the first patient ever on a PD-1 inhibitor, and he had some in over 9 years that he's been doing great. And really importantly, metastatic angiosarcoma was almost uniformly fatal, over 90% 1-year mortality rate. About 30% of patients with angiosarcoma now respond to PD-L1 inhibition. So because everyone was dying within a year, it's to Heather's point, when you have a strong signal, when the natural history is so uniformly bad, it came out so clear that now it actually got, it's now in treatment guidelines for angiosarcoma without ever having a randomized control trial done for it. And patients all over the world get it because it's just so clear that it works, and Michael's doctor and other doctors started prescribing it. And this is an example where it never got put on label, but it is being utilized all over the world off label. And of course, this is cancer, which in many cases can be different from other conditions. But I love this case because it required no brilliance at all, it required a Google search, and Michael's doing great. This is him at my cousin's wedding last September, 8 years after he should have died from his disease. So again, looking at the pharmacy shelf, how many more treatments are out there that are just waiting for us to find new uses for them, especially the generic drugs where there is no path forward for commercialization. So we launched a nonprofit organization about 3 years ago called Every Cure. And our mission is to save and improve lives by repurposing medicines. It's really simple. We believe that every drug that's approved for one thing should also be utilized for every disease that it can possibly treat. So I'll just quickly mention the approach that we take. So when we think about drug repurposing, it's typically in the way that we describe what I did with Castleman's. You start with the disease Castleman's, you look across all these drugs. In our case, we use serum proteomics, sometimes people use specific drug screens, but you're trying to find the best match for that disease, methoxyl, serologics, whatever it may be. Drug companies typically go in the reverse order. They start with a drug that's approved for one thing, and then they ask, are there other diseases that maybe could benefit from that drug? We do a combination of the two, and our term, which is way too long and complicated, is computational pharmacophonomics. The idea being that rather than starting with a single drug or single disease and looking for matches, you start with all drugs and all diseases, and you quantify the strength of matches across everything versus everything. So then you can find the best opportunity across all drugs and diseases. Not necessarily the best opportunity for Castleman's or a disease you care about, not necessarily the best opportunity for a drug or a drug that you make money off of. It's just what's the best opportunity out there to help people with the medicines that we have. And we do this by training a variety of algorithms on biomedical knowledge graphs. So knowledge graphs are just 2D representations of what the world knows about all drugs, diseases, genes, and proteins. So we train on known treats relationships. And then we ask these same algorithms to look across the rest of the world's knowledge to quantify the likelihood of every drug to treat every disease. So you could train it on, let's say, drug A to treating disease C and all the pattern and connections between it. And then you imagine that you ask the algorithm now look across every other match and give us a score. So if there's no way to connect a toenail fungus drug to pancreatic cancer, it's going to get a really low score. But if there's a way to connect lidocaine to breast cancer based on some important mechanism, it'll get a high score. So points here is you bring together as much data as you can, you structure these biomedical knowledge graphs, then you rank or you score every drug versus every disease, you get a single score. We'll be sharing those scores by April of next year with the world. So all 75 million scores will be publicly available. But we use the scores to help us to say, among all of the opportunities, all 75 million, every drug versus every disease, what are the things at the top that look really promising? You know, us humans, we can't think about every drug versus every disease and what the best opportunities are. But algorithms can get us to that rank order list, and then us humans can look at the top 1,000 or the top 100 or the top 10 and say, wow, arginine for sickle cell disease looks really interesting for this reason or that reason. We might do work in the lab and then sometimes move forward into clinical trials. In some cases, surprisingly, we found opportunities that are really strong where they're actually, there's already clinical data to support its use, but really the goal being to make sure to get it to as many patients as possible. In some cases, working directly with regulators to get label changes. A couple examples that I'm excited about. So we ran the algorithm for the first time ever, a little over 2 years ago. It took 100 days to run the algorithm to scan across the world's knowledge. As a side note, it takes 17 hours now to do the same thing. And that has nothing to do with our work. That's just compute has gotten a lot better these last 2 years. Ran it for the first time 2 years ago. Took 100 days. First set of scores we got. All 75 million scores. You can imagine we looked at Castleman's first just because that's a disease that I know well. And I was really interested to see the top hits. We had a patient right around that time named Alan who was not responding to any medicines. We had done similar proteomics work. We had done some laboratory testing of immune cells. And then we also got this result of all the drugs for Castleman's, and of course, all drugs for all diseases. And we're interested to see the top scoring drug was a TNF inhibitor called adalimumab. It had not been used before for Castleman's, but we also had this laboratory data pointing towards a TNF signature. So we thought maybe we could try a TNF inhibitor for this patient, Alan. Again, TNF inhibitors had never been used before. So we started out on it as the first patient ever with Castleman's, and he responded really well. This past February marked 2 years that he's been in remission on this TNF inhibitor after having a really, really difficult course. He had 5 deadly flares in his first 2 years of his disease, and now he's got 2 years in remission. So this was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in February. And so that's an example where we discovered a brand new treatment for Castleman's, which is super exciting. Saved Alan's life, and now we're using it in more patients. But as I mentioned earlier, alluded to, our algorithm is actually also really good at identifying treatments that us humans have already found, but we've discarded for one reason or other. Maybe we haven't fully discarded it, but we're just not fully utilizing because there aren't the incentives to do so. And so one that really stands out for me, I'm quite excited about, is that through this process, we've identified important work that's already been done around a large portion of children with autism, depending on your cohort, anywhere between 20% and 50% of kids with autism having anti-folate receptor alpha antibodies, which basically means that they cannot get their binding antibodies. They can get no folate into their brain. You need your folate receptor alpha to get folate into the brain. Turns out large portions of kids have autoantibodies to prevent folate from getting in the brain. Interestingly, humans have something called an RFC, which is a reduced folate channel, which allows reduced forms of folate to get into the brain, like methylfolate or folinic acid. And amazingly, there have already been 3 clinical trials that have been done, one in the US, one in France, and one in India, of using reduced forms of folate, so folinic acid, in children with autism who have anti-folate receptor alpha autoantibodies. And all 3 of the trials have been positive. The most recent one in India was a really robust and well-done trial. And even still, the fact that there's a large portion of kids who are using autoantibodies, folinic acid is also called leucovorin. It's been approved and around for 50 years. Costs 17 cents a pill to make. It's sold for 20 cents a pill. So you could sell a lot of pills and you would make no money. Even with all those things, it's really barely used at all in the United States. And so this is an example. This is Mason photographed here. Mason's a patient who received leucovorin. He was nonverbal for 3 years and began to speak within 3 days of starting leucovorin, just pretty incredibly. His first word he said was more, and I'm a parent. I feel like all my kids ask me for it more, so I could really appreciate how important it is to be able to say the word more. But actually, there's a video of him and how excited he was when he said more for the first time, and his mom understood. She gave him more food, and he was so excited, like he finally said a word she understood. And then Ryan, photographed on the right, was basically nonverbal for about 5 years. Started on leucovorin. He had very high levels of these autoantibodies. Within 2 weeks of starting leucovorin, said his first statement to his daddy. He said, "Daddy, I love you," as his first statement ever. And of course, I was talking to his dad recently. His dad was like, "I just cried for the next 15 minutes." But you know, verbal communication is something that is so important to all of us. And individuals with autism often describe verbal communication as being one of the biggest challenges that they face. So every cure, we're looking to discover new treatments, but we love to uncover treatments like this where other people have already done all the hard work. Let's just get the word out about them and make sure kids can actually benefit. So I'll just close. Last example is a patient named Joseph who was dying from a rare cancer called Poem syndrome. It has many similarities to multiple myeloma, and he was out of options. He was on 3 pressors in an ICU, and his girlfriend actually reached out to our team because Poems is similar to Castleman disease, and so we had met them previously, and we looked for promising opportunities that could potentially be useful for Poem syndrome. Recommended 3 drugs that are typically used for multiple myeloma. So again, not a huge stretch to recommend drugs for myeloma, for a disease that has similarities to myeloma, but his doctors had not thought to try them and was not going to try them. And Joseph responded really well. I saw him recently. He's doing great, more than a year since being on these treatments. So I think that one way to think about what we're doing with Every Cure is that previously we were looking for the lowest hanging fruit in a single tree. So what's the best treatment for Castleman's? What's the lowest hanging fruit in this one tree? But really what we're doing with Every Cure now is looking across the whole forest for the lowest hanging fruit out there. So not necessarily the Castleman's tree or the Balamuthia tree, but just what's the lowest hanging fruit out there, the best drug for the diseases that afflict us. And when you take this all versus all approach, you find things that you never would have expected to find if you hadn't looked for them, like leucovorin for autism, and arginine for sickle cell disease, lidocaine for breast cancer, you know, things that you never even would have thought to look for. And that's, I think, the value of this all versus all approach. So it's been a huge team effort. We're almost 3 years old, have received really transformative funding from groups like Arnold Ventures, Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, White Hill Philanthropies, and then more recently from ARPA-H, and then also TED puts on something called the Audacious Project. So it's really been just this tremendous effort of partners coming together to help us to get to where we are. Got a long way still ahead of us. And we have the most amazing board members, 2 of which are in the room, Tanisha and Janet, who have been helping to guide and lead our efforts. So just to close, we really need your help. Share repurposing ideas that you have with us. Every Cure.org/ideas. So if you are aware of a drug like Balamuthia or a drug for Balamuthia, let us know. Also share it through Care ID. And then also, as we find these trauma screen opportunities through our platform, we need people to evaluate them. So if you're very familiar with a condition and you want to volunteer to review opportunities, please do that. Help us with obtaining more data sets that can go into our platform and or developing improvements to the platform. Help us with evaluating these opportunities in the lab, clinical trials, and spreading the word about treatments. So I'm getting ready to launch our first campaign. It will be this fall around leucovorin for autism, the fact that these autoantibodies that can be tested for. And join our team. We've got some open roles that are important to us. So huge thanks to the team. Thank you all so much.
Thanks so much, David. Actually, you can come back up.
Sure.
We're gonna have you and Heather invite you back up too, and Christine Pulvis. We're also gonna invite you to come up. Feel free to take a seat.
Can I ask Heather a question?
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Great to the point.
Can you tell us about the next steps for this drug and Balamuthia? Are you working to get a label? Are you working to get it approved in the US? Sorry, that's all I can think about.
Tricky. So excitingly, CDC has opened an emergency IND, an intermediate IND to provide expanded access to pretty much all patients in the US. And they're recommending it. Balamuthia is quite strange in that basically every patient in the US gets referred to CDC for guidance in their treatment. And so,
Mic is on.
Oh.
Yeah, the power button there.
okay, we'll start over.
So the question was, what is the next step for nontraditional in the US and its treatment in Balamuthia? And so excitingly, the CDC, which interestingly in the US oversees or helps to advise on the treatment of pretty much all cases of free-living amoeba infections, which Balamuthia is one of them. And so they're now recommending the treatment, and they have managed to obtain an intermediate IND to provide expanded access to any patient in the US who wants it. The company has donated the drug for the time being, which is wonderful in terms of making it more accessible. I think we're trying to facilitate the exploration of more sustainable paths and whether, approval is a potential opportunity here. This is a unique case in that because the drug is not approved in the US, there are different paths and the company might be interested in approving it. They're also studying it for bladder cancer, I believe, or something totally unrelated. But so it's a winding tale. But I think there have been some exciting developments and trying to think about how partners like NCATS and CDC and others could play a role in trying to make sure, I think the key question is how do we make sure that there's access for patients? And I think we've made improvements for a while. There was like a single ID fellow who's the sole source of the drug in the US, which, her offering to jump on a plane and fly to wherever to provide the drug was very kind of her, but maybe not the most sustainable option. But, I think now we at least CDC can get the drug, I think, to patients within 24 hours because they now have a supply of the drug in the US. So that was a really exciting development. And now I think the next question is, is there a path to approval?
Okay, thank you. Can you guys hear me? Okay. I think we're okay. Christine, thanks so much for joining us up here also. I wonder if you want to give a quick introduction and maybe talk a little bit about NCAT's role. I know Heather alluded to the fact that FDA has been working with NCAT. Maybe you want to share a little bit more about that partnership.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Christine Colvis. I am the director of the Office of Drug Development Partnership Program at the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences. And one of the things, drug repurposing for us is very, very important. It's a high priority area for us. We have had a number of different approaches that we've taken to that. We have an intramural program where they actually do research there. They also were very involved in helping to develop the Cure ID app. We also have extramural programs where we actually support research for drug repurposing and for other programs. So probably the most recent and sort of most current one would be our biomedical data translator program, which is an AI system that one of the things it can do is to help you to identify potential drugs for treating diseases. I will say that, you know, as David kind of alluded to for the stuff that he's actually done, and both of you have to say, you know, it's very, very impressive stories, very, you know, you're real champions for drug repurposing. I think you're helping, you're helping to get the word out in very sort of salient ways, right? Of having these real stories, these human stories, where you see lives really being impacted. And I think that's when we build these tools, this is what we want to see. You know, we wanted to see, David, somebody like you to be able to take up this charge and take it to fruition. It's like we built the capability, but then we want to see somebody actually be able to take it the next step. And one fun little thing, only because I like just stumbled on this as I was sort of playing with our tool. One of the advantages of being able to do things with computationally is that not just that there's so much information that it's not even possible for a human to go through it. It's that I was looking at an example where I was really challenging the system. I wanted to know, you know, why it was returning, you know, particular things, and so I was digging in and came across a particular publication. I'm like, why did it even return this publication? The drug isn't mentioned anywhere. The alternative names to the drug isn't mentioned anywhere. But because we are connecting to so many different databases and making connections across them, what it actually had done was it had actually identified that paper because of the mechanism of action that was being discussed in the paper. And the drug is cited somewhere else in a completely different database. And that is something that for a human to actually do that, first of all, you'd have to know what sources to go to make that kind of a connection. For a human to do that, it's almost impossible. But once the system is set up, it can do this within minutes. It can return you this kind of information. Now, as a human, you're going to have that information just like you did a literature search, and you're going to have to go through it. So you're going to now spend hours or days, you know, really digesting it and figuring out how valuable it is and whether or not to pursue it. So the machines are not replacing us yet, but they're incredibly powerful and incredibly helpful. And, you know, again, just so excited to see the, you know, how this is truly impacting lives. So, yeah.
Well, I just want to add one follow-up. Thanks so much, Christine. The knowledge graphs that I mentioned that we're using in those algorithms on top of them, those were fully built by NCATS. I've heard that it was this NCATS team sort of thinking, what could we do with all this data? All this data's out there. How could it be structured? How could we make the most of it? And what I'd heard was that there were some possible use cases, but the belief was we don't even know how it's going to be used, but we feel this responsibility to really structure and put tens of millions of dollars into structuring and building this amazing resource that you may not even have known all, and we still don't know all the potential that's going to come from it. But if NCATS hadn't taken that huge leap of faith, this is back in the early 2010s, right? Then we would never be able to do any of the things that we're doing. It's really all on the shoulders, and we're so thankful for everything you guys have done. It's amazing.
All right, is this working? I think it's not. I'm going to switch out mics. Like 1 second. All right, there we go. That's better. So yeah, I'm really appreciative for all three of you being here and talking about the things that are already there to help us identify repurposing opportunities. But I wonder if maybe you could share a little bit about what challenges you see that still exist. Maybe it's in like there's new tools that we have now, but like, is there a way to connect those better to opportunities to just search, to do research on them once you find them? Or I guess, what do you see as the gaps and areas for more policy work here? And just to, maybe I'll go back one second, but just a reminder, these are kind of policy ideas that we have identified so far, but maybe there's other things that we're missing as well. But let's maybe start off with what gaps are remaining. So maybe Heather, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, there are so many things. Hard to know where to begin. So I mean, I think maybe at the lowest hanging fruit level, right? There's the like, how can we better integrate across all of our programs? And I'm really excited for the discussions that are ongoing. I mean, we've worked together since at least 2019. The first generic drug repurposing, I think, workshop. But you know, and I think we've made a lot of strides in terms of how we can collaborate, but there's more to do to figure out the best ways to integrate our different programs. So things like, you know, how can the data in Cure ID inform Translator or be used by every Cure? How can things that are discovered by every Cure or Translator be reported in Cure ID? So it becomes like a cyclical, you know, effect. So on that level, that's one challenge. I think, you know, sort of scaling up, Cure ID specifically, I see two major challenges. One is how do we get cases reported, which has been really challenging. I think I debate with myself about how much of it is that people don't know that the platform exists, which I think I hear a lot is the case, or aren't reminded of it, versus how much are people just not willing to share this information, and what are the drivers for that and why is that the case? And sometimes I think it's that, you know, they just don't have the time. So busy clinicians, you know, have a bazillion other things to do. And so they focus on, which is why we started thinking, well, maybe patients could report or maybe families could report. But sometimes I think there are other barriers. And so trying to figure those out. And then, you know, how does this data get used? Like, well, so let's say you're able to capture the information in Cure ID, you know, what happens next? And that's where I think getting to this question of, I really don't want to see a situation in which, you know, we exclusively rely on off-label use as the, you know, the solution to the problem. Because as you pointed out in your slides, there are a lot of limitations to off-label use. Like, it's really important to have it, but it's not the be-all and end-all. That's not to say that FDA approval is the be-all and end-all in every situation either. Like, I think there have to be different goals for different, you know, drugs and disease combinations, but having a pathway to robustly study the drugs that are identified in our various platforms and others. And then for those that it's appropriate, you know, to have a pathway to getting those on label that is realistically achievable by the stakeholders that are involved, I think would be really important. And we're a long ways from that point, I think, right now.
Yeah, totally agree. I think that, excuse me, from the identification side of things, I think that these tools are getting better and better, and we at Evercare, our team is just overwhelmed with the amount of great repurposing opportunities that we're coming across. It's both really exciting and also really depressing. To think that there's all these opportunities out there that just aren't helping people that are like at the CVS. But it's also really exciting. So I think that from the identification perspective, these tools are really good at finding them, and we've been really pleasantly surprised with the ability to find them. I think that to Ed's point, we could also, both through Cure ID and also through Evercare, we could also use more crowdsourcing support too. I love what our AI platform shared with us, but hearing directly from a patient or from a provider is really powerful too. So I think that, you know, ways that we can get people to do more of that would be great. For us, the hurdles are, okay, among all of these amazing opportunities, all of which, by the way, of course, look really great in one area and they have more problems in other areas, that they're not all sparkly, but, you know, some might be, it's going to be too long of a trial. Other cases, it might be, you know, maybe it's not as severe enough of a disease. But the challenge is which ones do you take forward into further evidence generation? And so we can do real world evidence analyses cheaply and quickly, but most of the time these drugs aren't being used off label, and we need to actually generate evidence from clinical trials. Clinical trials are really expensive, and they take a long time often, and so I think that, like, there's challenges around evidence generation and making sure that you have the funding to do those sorts of studies, and then also the partners to do things more efficiently. So maybe the trial doesn't need to take as long of a time if you can have the right collaborators to help with enrollment, for example. So I certainly, the second thing I'd say is around evidence generation from trials, figuring out how do we solve that. And the third is, I agree with Heather that I think it's less about what is the path to patients and more about, or what is the best path to patient for every opportunity, and more about how do we find the best path for every given opportunity, which might be different between different drug disease matches. And so really thinking with the end in mind, which is a world where every drug is used for every patient that it can possibly help. And so whether that means you get a label change or whether that just means that you're really good at marketing, and that we have clearance to be able to do like marketing of off-label drugs, which, as you know, drug companies cannot do, but nonprofits have been advocating for use of drugs off-label for decades. And so figuring out maybe clearance in that world of what you can and can't do. Can you advocate or can you educate about clinical trial data versus can you market, off-label? And so I think that is another place we get some clarity.
Yeah, and I would definitely agree with that last point, that getting the word out once you find something is going to be a real challenge. So one of the things I have a question for Heather is would you be permitted is there anything that would prohibit the FDA from actually reaching out to the company to say, to bring something to their attention? Or is it up to David to reach out to the company to do that? Leonard, maybe.
I was gonna say, maybe Leonard, to my knowledge, Janet or Leonard might be better placed to answer that question.
Yeah, there's no barrier to the FDA reaching out to companies and saying, in fact, that's sort of part of the obligation. People are around, perhaps a nonprofit is urging people to use a drug or get some clinical guidelines. I would argue it's the FDA's obligation to bring this to a company's attention and say, could this actually be brought to the next level? But there's no bar to it.
Right, and I think that it does happen informally from my understanding, but again, then you get into the problem of what is the incentive for the company? And once the drug is off patent, there's very little currently. Right.
Yeah, I mean, and then I was just gonna say, just generally then at the other end of it, more data. So grateful for Cure ID, and I'm not just saying that because I'm Kathleen's involved in development. I was involved in all this development, but that kind of thing and getting that information where, in fact, this is even in humans. These aren't in model systems. These aren't in cells. These aren't biochemical, assays. This is actually something that was tested in human, whether it worked or not. It's data. It's useful. It would be really useful to have. So yeah, sorry.
So that actually, I have one question, because when you said that the drugs you're looking at no longer have exclusivity, that has a particular meaning in the generic drug world. And then somebody else just said they're off patent, which is different than not having data exclusivity any longer. So one, which are we talking about? And then two, as a follow-up to that, have you included that in your databases? Do you search the patent applications also? Are they included in there? Because that will certainly, because they're more likely, somebody's going to maybe apply for a patent before they publish a paper because of the rules around prior art.
I can speak to the last part. We do use data from patent applications. The one problem is that companies are notorious for over filing. So if they think it's possible their drug might work in even a class of diseases, they'll file for all of them because it just costs so little to add additional indication. So the patent applications are not, we haven't found them to be particularly helpful because companies just sort of overfile. And then to your prior comment or question around which one are we talking about here? I think that the short answer is that we're talking about drugs where any competitor could immediately produce that compound. The moment where there can be competitor, I talked about leucovorin for autism, 17 cents a pill to make, selling it for 20 cents a pill. no one's making any money off selling more leucovorin. And so those are the cases where I think that it becomes really important that the federal government, that nonprofits, that academia, that we all work together. And I did just make a comment that I think it's so cool that we've got someone from NIH, from FDA, and then I'm part of an organization that's funded through ARPA-H, like different aspects of the government are all working together on this. And of course, we're part of this Duke Margolis community. I think it's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I will say for Cure ID, we don't limit it to off patent or, anything with data exclusivity. We encourage submissions for all drugs, so including those that are on patent still. But I think to David's point, where I see the greatest opportunity as well as the greatest need because of the lack of incentives is where, and actually, I don't have enough expertise to know the difference about the patent. I mean, I understand some about the patent versus exclusivity, but I'm not going to go into which one is the correct statement. But just to say that where there can be competition and where there is a lack of incentive for companies to pursue further applications for new indications is where we think that there's the greatest, need for government and nonprofit and others to step in.
Yeah, thanks. And I think like the definition that we use is the loss of exclusivity, because to this point, like it's about there being able to be competitors in the market. I think if there is some exclusivity still that, prevents other manufacturers from being in the market, that there is still some incentive there for them to maybe do some research. So yeah, I think that's how we've been defining it. But thank you so much to all three of you for sharing some more about some of these gaps and challenges. And I think, David, to your point too, just like, seeing like the different agencies or like different parts of government that you have represented here. And to kind of bring us back to like the point of today's conversation, which is the role of the regulator too. But I think part of that role is also collaborating with other government agencies too. And I think some of the recommendations we have right now around that, so like, are there ways to like expand Cure ID and get that plugged into maybe some funding from NIH or other places? Are there opportunities maybe, as we have these more and more opportunities we're identifying, how can we prioritize where we want to put that funding? Like, where are the areas where there's most need? And is there an effort that we could do to help with that prioritization process? So I'm not sure if you have any immediate reactions to some of the solutions that we've suggested or other suggestions that you might have for potential solutions to address some of these challenges. And then also if anyone in the audience has input as well, we're happy to take questions. I'm getting some questions from online too. I'll pass on in a moment, but maybe start with the reactions to some of the policy solutions we've identified so far.
I mean, I'm always delighted about anything that involves more funding for Cure ID. That's an easy one. No, but I mean, how to use that funding responsibly and effectively is, I think, a more difficult question, and one, I really do think that there is this question of like, how do we make that system work for the public and for public health, and how do we get people to report to it, and then this question of how do we move the drugs forward. And so I am very interested in whether, and have been thinking for a long time about whether there are opportunities to have more direct collaborations or formal collaborations perhaps with NIH, with ARPA-H, with whomever, BARDA, to have a sort of dedicated pathway. And this is, unfortunately, we had a public-private partnership before that David was co-chair of the advisory board for, that is no longer funded. But their real explicit goal was basically to think about like, how do we, if we identify positive signals, for hypothesis generation and Cure ID, like how do we move that through the process of getting it studied robustly and ultimately, hopefully, approved. And FDA can't do that alone. And, can't do some of it at all, but certainly can't do it alone. And so I think the question of, can there be a more systematic process? Right now, it's very ad hoc of, we identify a signal, it gets funded for a trial by NIH or ARPA-H or whomever. The trial is developed collaboratively, like was done with Operation Warp Speed, so that the data will actually support approval if that's the goal. There's, mechanisms to ensure that there is a path to approval or to, adequate communication of the benefits if those are demonstrated robustly, et cetera, et cetera. But that there's a more systematic path forward, both in terms of funding the studies and designing, the studies and prioritizing what is going to have the greatest public health benefit.
And maybe just a follow, we actually did get a question online about why the funding was suspended for the consortium that was existing. I'm not sure if you want to address that. I think that is like a question we've gotten from some people in the online space.
It's hard to demonstrate success in the kinds of timeframes that people want to see success in government. So, I think we're talking about like major changes to the system and to the way that things have historically been done. And so unfortunately, despite really impressive efforts by the group at CPATH, we just weren't able to kind of move the system along as fast as we could. And there are just always competing priorities. So, we've been very grateful that we've been able to sustain some support for Cure ID itself. That in and of itself, given the current environment, has been, quite miraculous, and thankful to our collaborators at NIH for, helping to try to support it. But, unfortunately, there just wasn't enough funding for CPATH as well. But I think the idea is still a good one.
Yeah. I think, being relatively, we're still facing funding challenges from government. So I think that's something to keep in mind in our conversations. Amy, I think you had a question. Was it pertaining?
Question or comment. I just wanted to follow up on Rick's question about exclusivity versus patent, because to me, when the word exclusivity is used, it's orphan drug market exclusivity. And so and because so many of these are rare diseases, I just want to make a comment that I think it's really important to discuss them as separate barriers and make sure that you're looking at the timing, because if exclusivity still exists, exclusivity exists, and their patent and exclusivity are on different timelines. So,
yeah.
Except you can section 8 out orphan drug indication. If it's already approved for some things,
right.
you can section 8 out
Yeah.
the orphan drug, the follow-on indications.
But if we're going to talk about lack of incentive, each of these is huge.
I agree.
Yeah.
That's a great point. Thank you.
And I think we need better understanding, like, I'm an epidemiologist, so the patent stuff is not really my forte, but I think that's why it's so important to have forums like this where we have lawyers in the room, we have, we have doctors, we have every, and that way, like, we can all learn from each other, because the details do matter. And I think that there are, the incentives are quite different depending upon which feature you're talking about.
I want to continue going through for your reactions to about solutions, but Tanisha, I saw your hand too.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's always amazing to hear from David and Heather. I mean, I love every time there's somebody that claps and gives some kind of standing ovation. Because I think that when you hear these stories of what works, it's so clear. And why we're here today and why Beth and the team have invested in doing the research is how do we bring things to scale? And just a reflection, and David knows my bias towards this, but when you think about the story of Castleman, what made it so powerful is these incredibly strong connections to a disease advocacy group or a patient group. And so when I think, Heather, for you on Cure ID, like what can we do to connect Cure ID up with the patient ecosystem that can be your amplifier? Like you're not going to have millions of dollars to do a public affairs campaign. But you may not need it, right? We need these strong relationships. And, what I wrote down in my notes is, do we really have a problem finding like the opportunities? It feels like we have more opportunities than we'll ever have capital and resources. So it's how do we work with the people who most need those opportunities to bring them to fruition?
So it's an excellent point, and I think you're absolutely right. I think we've seen some modest success in that space. So as an example, a couple of years ago, we got really interested in long COVID, and we were able to partner up with the patient-led research collaborative and with some of the ME groups and some of the dysautonomia groups, and people like Hannah Davis, who's just this incredible patient champion, has done more to get us cases and to move that field forward and to think about clinical trials and to work on analyzing the data with us than like anybody else, right? So that has been a tremendous collaboration, and it's been her advocacy and those like her, and she's just one example, but those like her who have really convinced patients to share their experiences, because there is some distrust, it's I joke that sometimes like we want to emphasize it as FDA and NIH, and sometimes we want to maybe not emphasize it as FDA and NIH, so, as much. But I think having, really committed patient advocates has been critical. Again, the scalability of that has been very challenging, and it's not a short-term fix. Like, it takes a lot of relationship building and sustained commitment. And unfortunately, government moves really, really slowly. And so it's hard to, keep people invested long term. But I think where we have been able to do that, it has been quite successful.
And I want to give David and Christine both chances to respond to thoughts on solutions and next steps.
Sure, yeah, and I just totally agree with you, Tanisha. I think that connections to patient groups is essential for this kind of work. In terms of the three blue boxes, I think that I agree all of them are important. In the same way that Heather is supportive of QRV expansion, I'm certainly supportive of continued support from ARPA-H and others for the work that we're doing at Every Care, of course. With identification, what I would say with the prioritization, sorry, as someone who's done a lot of drug repurposing for specific diseases and now taking this all versus all approach, it is just so much more efficient and effective to not start with a disease or a drug. Every week, so we have an amazing medical team that's based in Boston. Every week, our medical team is literally going through dozens and sometimes hundreds of opportunities and finding a handful a week of these amazing opportunities to help save and improve lives. They're out there, but if we had started with a disease, the likelihood that any one of those 18,000 diseases can have, this low-hanging fruit shining star is very low. But it's when you look across everything versus everything and you use the world's knowledge, all those connections, that's where you find them. So the idea of disease prioritization, I think would be a misstep if we would try to really say, what diseases are we going to do repurposing for? I think it has to be the other way around. I think that you pick the disease based on the fact that there's a good drug for that disease. And again, this is someone who's did it the other way around a lot. You can do it the Castleman's way for sure. You can do it the Valamuthia way for sure. But if you just want to do it the most efficient way to help save and improve lives at a systems level, I think you have to work backwards from the matches. What drug for what disease, and then how do you resource them?
Also why we've expanded to all diseases and
Yeah, but true, but David, also you're taking signals from the clinical world.
Yes.
So you're not just looking at the pathways, sorry.
That's exactly right. It's such a great point. And when we talk about these knowledge graphs that NCATS has built, the most beautiful thing about them is that they're really data agnostic. And so there's clinical trial data embedded in there, there's pathway data, there's case reports. It's about having this really holistic view of everything about a drug, everything about a disease, everything about a gene or protein. It's a great point.
And just to build on that, I think for David and Heather in these types of organizations, that's absolutely right. That's the most efficient path, because you have research foundations and patient foundations that are focused on the other side of that bow tie, right? And to bring them together, I think, is the part that we just haven't figured out how to do that at scale.
Such a great point. Yes, the disease organizations that keep doing disease-specific drug repurposing, and groups like ours, I think, have this opportunity to do what I would consider like impact-driven drug repurposing, where you're not guided by specific disease or drug, where you're guided by what's the best opportunity for impact.
Yeah, no, so I mean, I think I'll just say that when I first heard about, sort of your approach, because, in the translator system, we had built it to tell us, what drugs might treat a disease, to connect genes to chemicals and do all these other things. And we did, what chemicals would up or down regulate a gene, and then we flipped that one, what genes would be up or down, what genes would be affected by a particular chemical. And I was kicking myself for having never reversed it the way that you actually did, because it's really, it is the way that I think we get at scale, is to actually say what diseases would be treated by this one drug. And so, I think it's really, really exciting, and, I can't wait to see what happens with that.
Where I'm trying to give some time, we have 1 minute remaining. I have one question online that sent to whoever wants to answer it. So there's a question about drugs that are approved outside the US but might have other uses. And there's a question about other pathways besides emergency use IND or EAP. So I don't know, Heather, I don't know if you have some thoughts on that, or anyone else wants to chime in, but we'll wrap up with that last question.
Yeah, I mean, if a drug is approved elsewhere, it can follow a normal path to approval in the US. And that comes with, patentability, exclusivity, et cetera. So there's, in some ways more incentive for groups to do that. There is the bar to approval of, substantial evidence of safety and efficacy. And sometimes you can leverage data. So for example, with the 505(b)(2) pathway, you can use data from the published literature, data that company didn't produce itself, and that can be used to obtain the NDA. And so, for example, in some instances, groups have relied on trial data that was produced in other countries. The details of that situation and it's the ability to use that approach depend on the specific use case. And so, it always has to be come to the review division early and often, it always has to be a discussion with the review division. But yes, I mean, I think there is generally a path forward for, besides expanded access, to approval.
Thank you. And I think that's a really good segue to our next section. We'll get more into regulatory approval. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Say something. I'd like to step back a little bit and ask us all, why are we talking about bake sales and philanthropy? When we're talking about the actual translation of the basic science to the people of this country. Why we have one tiny institute of translational medicine in the United States, and all the rest is focused on basic science. Okay, it's wonderful. We have all this science now, but really, I think at some level, we shouldn't be talking about Band-Aids over this big problem, that the elephant in the room, which is the basic science enterprise is like, a nest full of baby birds all over the country. Okay, they just need more feeding all the time. All right, and yet they are not fit to translate that you've shown. I mean, these things are like lying beside the road, not to trivialize the efforts, but they're out there, and yet we're not doing them. And so I do think we shouldn't just concentrate on the band, doing what we can, fixing what we can. We ought to have a very strong message that this is not right. It was right in 1970 when we didn't even know about what the genome did, right? And we had never heard of the proteome, et cetera, but it's not right now. And, this is going to persist, these problems, unless we shift more funding into actually doing the translational research that'll get these treatments into the hands of doctors and patients. And so I just want to make that statement because I think, we just get busy and do what we can, right, to remedy this situation. But we ought to step back also and never relay to the funders that this is okay. We have this in hand. We just need a little bit more philanthropy or a few more grants or whatever, and it'll all be all right.
This is why I'm so grateful to have the former regulator here next time. She can say things. But I mean, to that point, I really do think that we need systematic change at a larger scale. And going back to your previous slide, let's talk about that right-hand bottom corner, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the right-hand bottom corner there, a new federal initiative. I think it's a great call to action for just that. We can do little pockets of things too, but I think we should be thinking bigger about what we can do with drug repurposing and how to translate these great opportunities into things that will actually help patients. So I know we're over time on the session, but thank you so much to our panelists. I'm going to go back to that Slido screen because we have a poll there because I also want our audience to weigh in on these solutions. So we have a poll there that we can rank the ones that we have there based on what you think is most feasible, what you think should be a priority. And there's also space for you to enter your own ideas with others. And so really interested in getting your feedback there. We're going to take a break, which I think we'll still aim for 15 minutes.
Thanks so much. We're going to go ahead and start back up in just a minute with session 2 on regulatory pathways for non-traditional developers. A couple of things, housekeeping and comments. It sounds like folks in the audience can hear, I'm sorry, folks online can hear just fine when audience members speak through the microphones up top. But two requests. One, if you could state your name and affiliation, folks are curious kind of, I know, it's hard to remember how, that would be super helpful. And then I do think we'll also probably still try and run the mic because even though online they can hear folks from the audience really well, which is delightful. Sometimes in the back of the room, it sounds like folks can hear as well. So we'll do a little mic run also. And then I mentioned this is, I think I mentioned this is the first time that I've been doing any work on drug repurposing, unlike Beth and some other colleagues. But I've learned a couple of things since I've been here. And one is you start with presentations from Heather Stone and David Fagenbaum. It's really phenomenal to see kind of like the identifying opportunities, et cetera. And frankly, you need that because all that follows is pretty hard work. And that's what we're going to get to now. So Beth laid out in the opening presentation that there aren't necessarily direct pathways for non-manufacturers to work on approvals. Obviously, we see the benefit of updated labels leading to reimbursement access, et cetera, et cetera. So in our framework, based on research today, conversations, presentations, our fall meeting, we've identified some potential solutions. And we look forward to kind of engaging about those now. Do a deep dive on 505(b)(2) regulatory pathways. Sarah Koblitz will come up in just a moment and lead a presentation there. And then very excited to have Devin speak to some work at RebootRx on some potential 505(b)(2) labeling update options. And then we'll, similar to last go around, open discussion. We've got some questions here, but really excited more than anything to get the input from you all, either online or in the room. So with that, first up, Sarah Koblitz, attorney and director at Hyman Phelps and McNamara. She's going to give us a primer on the existing pathways and updating for drug labeling, 505(b)(2), which we all know so much about here, and some other ancillary information. Sarah, please, whenever you're ready.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Koblitz. I'm a director at Hyman Phelps and McNamara. My practice focuses on product lifecycle management, including regulatory strategies and the use of abbreviated pathways to bring drugs to market. So I'm going to talk about the regulatory landscape that we're currently working in, kind of a background to level set where we are now so we can talk about how we can go forward. Because of the way things currently are, we might have to talk about needing legislative changes or other sorts of regulatory changes to implement these pathways, the repurposing pathways that we're discussing. So we wanted to make sure that everybody understood where we're working at now. So there are three different types of drug applications. These are all filed by sponsors. There's no pathway to market now for a non-sponsor. And sponsors are typically your manufacturers or they're companies that work with manufacturers to get products onto the market. So the first type of application is a full 505(b)(1) or a new drug application, and that includes full reports of studies to prove safety and effectiveness. That's typically 2 randomized controlled trials that you can get to market with a shorter pathway with one trial, but that's pretty rare. Then we have the 505(b)(2) pathway, and this is where the NDA, it's a form of NDA, a form of new drug application, where the applicant does not have the right of reference to full reports that are necessary for approval. And then you have the abbreviated new drug application under section 505J, and these are your traditional generics. And there's no requirement for submitting full reports, so there's no requirement to submitting randomized controlled trials. In fact, you can't submit randomized controlled trials under this pathway. The approval under this pathway is based on a showing of similarity to a previously approved drug product. So what is a 505(b)(2) application? It's a type of full NDA that's subject to the full reports requirement, but some of the safety and effectiveness studies that are necessary
to satisfy the full reports requirement are not conducted by the 505(b)(2) applicant or not on their behalf. And for which the applicant has no right of reference, which means that they don't own the underlying data. The reliance is on FDA's findings of safety and effectiveness, and there's no access. You don't get any access to the underlying data. This is often viewed as a hybrid between a full NDA and an ANDA because of that reliance. In an ANDA, you also rely on FDA's findings of safety and effectiveness, but you also might need to submit new evidence, like in a 505(b)(1). This is typically used for approval of changes to a previously approved drug, like a new dosage form or new indication, or it might be used for something like based on published literature. So your typical 505(b)(2) applications are new formulations that require clinical studies, new dosage regimens, different salts of previously approved active ingredients, the new combinations of previously approved actives, a new indication, an RX to OTC switch, or a complex drug where clinical investigations are necessary to show that the active ingredient is the same. And that's because FDA's Office of Generic Drugs cannot review clinical investigations, and so you cannot submit those in an ANDA. So where the sameness requires something beyond a bioequivalent study, you have to go through a 505(b)(2). Even though the statute indicates that full reports are required for a 505(b)(2), FDA interprets it to allow you to rely on published literature or FDA's prior findings of safety and effectiveness for a listed drug. So the studies that you could rely on in published literature are things that have been published now out there for years, but they have to meet the FDA standard for safety and effectiveness. So they have to meet their kind of 5 factors that FDA has laid out for whether published literature is sufficient to be relied upon. So you have to meet those standards, or you have to be able to reference another drug and say that your product can be approved based on FDA's findings of safety and effectiveness for the other drug. So you need to have data for these applications. The applicant is only required to submit new data, though, to support safety and efficacy for whatever change is introduced in the 505(b)(2) application. And in some cases, no additional clinical studies may be necessary. And now we're going to contrast the 505(b)(2) to an ANDA, and I can get into more specifics on the 505(b)(2) side if there are questions afterwards, but I'm just kind of giving a general overview now. But the ANDA is kind of a sister to the 505(b)(2), and it's the primary means of approving generic drugs. They have abbreviated data requirements. Safety and effectiveness data is not required. It's presumed if the generic drug is shown to be the same as the previously approved drug. And the clinical data is generally that can be submitted for the application is limited to bioequivalent studies. They're much more simple to get approved, and they're much less costly than a 505(b)(2) would be, in part because you don't have to submit studies, and in part because of the application fees, which we'll get to at the end. So there are two routes for an ANDA. You can be the same as the listed drug, which is your previously approved drug that you're looking to copy. That's it's called the reference listed drug. Or you can do an approved suitability petition, which is asking FDA for permission to file an ANDA. And it's available for certain differences from the listed drug. Same means same active ingredient, dosage form, strength, route of administration, and conditions of use, except those uses protected by patents or non-patent exclusivity. It also means bioequivalent in this case for an ANDA. And that means that the rate and extent of which the API becomes available at the site of action is the same as the reference listed drug. And this is shown through in vitro and in vivo testing. If the product is not bioequivalent, then it has to go through the 505(b)(2) pathway. But if you meet these criteria, you can be approved in an ANDA and you can be automatically substituted for the reference listed drug. And something that's really important to note on the 505(b)(2) side is that it cannot be automatically substituted for the reference listed drug unless FDA has made a finding of therapeutic equivalence. which takes a long time. Which is part of why the ANDA process is often favored over the 505(b)(2) process and the cost. Then there's the suitability petition, which permits the submission of an ANDA for drug with certain differences from the listed drugs. The allowable differences are the active ingredients, if you are submitting a combination product, the route of administration, the dosage form, and strength. Like I said, you have to ask FDA permission to file one of these applications. And it is a process that goes through the citizen petition process. It's called the suitability petition. And FDA responds to that. I think it's now within 180 days of submission. It used to be FDA would never respond. But it's gotten to be a lot more quick in the last year or so, which is shocking given that everything else in this administration is not. But suitability petitions become publicly available, so other companies, other competitors might know what you're looking to do. But the ANDA has to be submitted the request has to be submitted publicly, and the ANDA cannot be submitted until the suitability petition is granted. FDA will grant a suitability petition unless investigations must be conducted to show safety and effectiveness. And the drugs approved in suitability petitions are not pharmaceutical equivalents, so they cannot be substituted for their reference listed drug. So it's very similar to the 505(b)(2) pathway. But it used to be disfavored because it took so long to get suitability petition response. But now that we're getting quicker responses, I'm seeing more clients very interested in using the suitability petition route to get to market instead of the B2 route. And the ANDAs do not require full reports, but they cannot require any clinical studies and they can only require bioequivalent studies. But sometimes limited confirmatory testing is allowed. Safety and efficacy is presumed if the generic is shown to be the same as the pioneer drug, and the timing of ANDA approval depends on patent and non-patent exclusivity of the listed drug. Since we're talking here about drugs that are off patent and off exclusivity, I won't go into the specifics of how you go about filing, the timing and how you go about filing for patent protected or exclusivity protected drugs. But it can be really complicated and it makes the process much more costly. And this brings us to user fees. These are fees that you incur just for filing an application. And they are substantial. Under PDUFA, a 505(b)(2) that contains clinical data has to pay $4,310,000 for fiscal year 2025 just to get FDA to review the application. When there's no clinical data, so you're just submitting some bioequivalent studies or some published literature, it's $2,155,000. And then program fees, which you have to pay per strength to FDA every year, are $400,000. So it's very costly to have a 505(b)(2). The PDUFA, on the other hand, the PDUFA fees or the generic drug user fees are much less significant, but still they're a lot for generic companies. But they're $321,920 for fiscal year 2025. And the program fees for small manufacturers are $189,000. For large manufacturers, it's $1.89 million. That's just my overview, and I always have Kirk Kars would be upset with me if I didn't put in a plug for the FDA law blog. So we end every HPM lawyers end every presentation with a plug for the HPM law blog. But I am more than happy to answer any questions. I know I kind of did a cursory overview of that, but any specifics, I'm happy to answer. Yes.
Just for clarity on the fees,
Yeah.
they're quite a bit lower for an orphan drug though, yes?
For an orphan drug, they're waived.
They're waived.
Yes.
That's
So as long as you
quite a
have
bit
orphan
lower.
drug designation,
Yeah.
it is waived. But ANDAs are not eligible for orphan drug designation. But yes, they are completely waived for orphan drug fees, but the program fees are not. So only the application fee is, the program fees you still have to pay.
Thank you so much for that. Yes, that is kind of a cursory overview in the context of, we could talk for 20 hours about B2. It was really interesting to hear the points about suitability petitions being
Yeah.
used so much more frequently. I think that's a thread we might pull on a little bit more when we get to the full
Yeah.
Q&A. So that was pretty interesting in particular, but thank you so much when it comes to something that Heather was saying, and really kind of everybody else that we've talked over the last 9 months, that jump of finding a signal and or some of those examples that David shared about just so much evidence for, certain select cases, but that's still just the beginning in that process of B2 or suitability petitions and labeling updates. There's such a bridge in between. Okay, next, Devin Crittenden, Director of Strategy and Operations at Reboot RX. She's going to share a proposed solution they have and working on to create a pathway for non-traditional developers. Devin, thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. First, I'd just like to acknowledge Arnold Ventures for their support on this policy proposal that we've developed. And it is, okay, I can see that one. Wonderful. So, as we all can see today, repurposing generic drugs is an untapped opportunity in order to meet unmet patient needs in chronic diseases, cancer, and rare diseases, as well as create low-cost treatment options. And we first began looking at how FDA approval can influence repurposed generic drugs and their adoption, having specific approval for the repurposed indication. When we're speaking about generics, they may already be FDA approved in a different indication space, and they have a long history of safe patient use. But within the specific indication, there are particular advantages to having FDA approval. So through extensive market research, we found that FDA approval for a repurposed indication can help build physician confidence and support the clinical adoption to reach patients. It enables guideline inclusion and payer reimbursement for increased access, and also allows broader communication, so the ability to speak more freely and more promotion activities around that specific indication. However, obtaining regulatory approval is a challenge. As Sam was diving into this, off-patent drugs really offer no exclusivities, so drug manufacturers lack the financial incentives in order to be the drivers within this. And nonprofits are stepping in to help fill those gaps. Yet, nonprofits are not the traditional sponsor of an FDA application. And nonprofits face significant barriers applying on their own, particularly in the technical requirements. So as we have been gathering input, we first dive into the 505(b)(2) NDA, and Sarah's wonderful overview here, but within the current paradigm, it allows for reliance on data that's not gathered by the sponsor or the sponsor does not have right of reference to. So this includes the literature or prior FDA findings, especially for safety. So there's a reliance on literature may not be applicable for the new efficacy data in that indication space. Additionally, within the current 505(b)(2) approval pathway, it still requires the full NDA, including those technical requirements such as your chemistry, manufacturing, and controls data, which is typically held by the manufacturer. So at RebootRx, we were envisioning how can we expand this in order to allow nonprofits to step into this space and take a more active role. And here we developed a proposal for the labeling only 505(b)(2) concept. And within this, we're addressing the challenges that nonprofits routinely face. Because they're not manufacturing the products, they're not intending to bring a new product to sale, but rather the goal is to have FDA approval so that the existing products on the market would be able to be utilized by patients for their repurposed use. Within the proposal, we're extending the reliance on third-party data to include the manufacturing information. so that the nonprofit only is submitting evidence that would be needed to support the new indication. And this is specifically designed for generic drugs with no product changes, so no reformulations or new dosage, that already have multiple interchangeable versions available on the market that are A-rated for substitution within the Orange Book, and have a well-established manufacturing history that is supported through rigorous documentation. Essentially, drugs where there are no surprises in terms of how they are made. Within the labeling only 505(b)(2), some of the current obstacles that we're trying to address that a nonprofit would face. First is providing manufacturing data. So as I mentioned, the chemistry, manufacturing, and controls, the CMC, this is data on how the products are made and tested and traditionally held by the manufacturers. Additionally, sponsors must provide drug samples, and only those who are making the drug will have these samples readily available if the FDA were to request them. And lastly, after approval of an application, the sponsor must conduct safety monitoring and product surveillance, as well as the annual reporting. This is a pretty typical activity that you would see manufacturers, but something that would be an expanded capacity for nonprofits. Within our proposal, we are suggesting that nonprofits would reference existing manufacturing data from previously approved applications. Traditionally, in previously approved applications, the CMC data is redacted or blacked out so that it's not a section in which other would be able to reference. So extending out that ability to reference in order to encompass CMC for these generic products. Additionally, nonprofits, upon request from the FDA, would be able to send in samples of drug products that are available on the market. It is also up to the discretion of the FDA if they are going to request samples during the process of the review. And so in some instances, the reviewer may waive that requirement. And then lastly, in terms of minimizing the product surveillance, we would be keeping the status quo, because the nonprofit would not be advancing a new product to market, but rather be extending only a label indication. Current manufacturers would retain the primary responsibility for the safety monitoring and surveillance of their own products that patients are taking, and the nonprofit would take on the responsibility for the specific repurposed indication. So as we have been vetting this concept and seeking input from various stakeholders, in order to ensure that there's maximum patient impact and feasibility, there are a few barriers that we have encountered with this proposal. First, for nonprofits is generating or accessing regulatory level efficacy data. Assumed in the labeling only is that the nonprofit would still be bringing the same level of evidence that would be applicable to any other NDA. And we'll discuss that a little more on subsequent slides. And then next, managing the post-marketing surveillance. While within the 505(b)(2) labeling only proposal, the nonprofit might have fewer requirements. This is still an atypical activity, and so it would require an expansion. And when we're talking about the repurposing nonprofits, generally they are small organizations that don't have a lot of capacity to move that forward. So in terms of feasibility, it would be a huge responsibility. Next is taking on the full legal liability for the new repurposed indication. Again, with small nonprofits, this would be a burden in terms of how they're able to go about their operations, while the manufacturers of the generic products would likely still be the primary responsible party for any of the manufacturing or product defects. Any patient harm related to the specific repurposed indication may be a liability for the nonprofit advancing this. And then lastly, high costs. All of this comes with costs. The three previous bullets, as well as the user fees that Sarah had mentioned. So speaking to what regulatory level data is, and in terms of some of our conversations with other nonprofits who may be able to utilize this pathway, there's still an expectation that they would meet the regulatory basis, which can vary depending on the disease severity, its rarity, and unmet needs. Across drug repurposing, we are looking at groups that specialize in rare diseases all the way to common diseases like cancers that we do at ReBooterX. And so the scale of proportion here is very varied. And it could be as little as one well-conducted study that is adequate and well-controlled with some confirmatory evidence, all the way up to 2 large RCTs with hard endpoints and long-term follow-up. And any clinical trial should be conducted under IND or follow the good clinical practice standards for maintaining that high evidentiary standard. Lastly, oftentimes with clinical trials, especially for new indications and new patient populations, access to patient-level data is required. Within repurposing, there are 3 main sources that we see for this efficacy data that would support a new indication. The first is pharma-sponsored trials. This is their bread and butter. Typically, pharma-sponsored trials are going to be under IND. And within repurposing generics, they're often older. So from before the patent expiration, when the pharmaceutical company was exploring additional indications for their product. And pharmaceutical companies would have a low incentive in order to share this due to any liabilities. The second source that is very common is academic investigator-initiated trials. So folks at academic centers who are able to run clinical trials. But oftentimes these are done under IND exemptions and may lack the appropriate regulatory oversight or access to organized patient-level data that could really support an NDA. And then the last option is any new trials that the nonprofit is able to run. However, here it's really costly to generate this robust regulatory grade data under the appropriate oversight, which again, for a nonprofit organization can be quite a challenge. So as we're thinking about what it might take in order to really advance a labeling only pathway that a nonprofit would be able to actively utilize, first, the nonprofit would need access to the data and funding in order to generate this regulatory level data, as well as an understanding of what that means. So an FDA guidance on what these evidentiary standards are for repurposed drugs and an understanding of what flexibilities may be based on the disease area. Third, user fee waivers for nonprofit sponsors would help alleviate some of the cost burdens of this. In some instances, it may fall under an orphan drug designation for that initial user fee. And there is a third clause in terms of not being able to recoup the cost of development within a certain time frame. But I believe that is a much lesser used portion of the orphan drug designation. 3 times. And so having clarification on that would be readily used within this context. And then a centralized third-party entity that could help nonprofits manage the post-marketing obligations, similar to what we see with CDMOs or CROs, in order to ensure that there's an infrastructure in place for nonprofits to maintain the appropriate responsibilities. And then lastly, risk mitigation strategies for nonprofits in terms of how they can best address any liabilities and ensure that those are not then pushed onto the patient. And at ReBooterX, the next steps that we are taking in order to advance this labeling only pathway, we do believe that the FDA has the current authority in order to establish this. And it could be done through a roadmap, pilot, or guidance by extending that flexibility to reference CMC data. Or if needed, through legislative action. We are also looking to engage stakeholders in order to help shape this pathway and really ensure that we're able to reach patients, as well as identifying strong use cases that would show the feasibility and value of this. So which generic drugs are ready to be repurposed and have the label expansions. And lastly, as nonprofits, we need to assess when FDA approval is really adding value. And this may be based on what the availability of the product looks like, are payers covering it on a regular basis, are clinicians using it routinely in their practice, and do patients need it, and when? Thank you.
Stick around, please. Sarah, can I call you back up also? So first, a compliment. It's so hard to talk about such complex legal, regulatory, detailed topics in concise, clear, understandable ways. So that was a bit of a masterclass for me both. Thank you very much. Before we jump into questions, a friendly reminder that if you're commenting from the audience, please just introduce yourself so that folks know who's on the line. We'll also do mic running. It has been picked up quite well on the audience, for the audience online, but in the back of the room, not always perfectly heard. And then I think the second ask of the audience here in person, because this is such technical material and it often falls into real specialties like product liability, et cetera. I don't know that Sarah or Devin could necessarily answer all of the pressing questions. So please help them out as well when we're in the weeds, if you happen to have a particular expertise there. So done a really good job throughout the morning, both sessions, of identifying kind of the challenges for non-traditional developers. So I think I'll probably jump into some of the proposed solutions right off the bat. One of the things that's come up a decent amount in conversations to date and a bit today is, ideas for how the regulator might be able to help non-traditional developers better understand some of the complexities, 505(b)(2) submissions, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, thanks so much. We do have the QR code for Slido up, and we'll be incorporating questions from the audience as well. Do you all have any folks, do you two have any ideas for either expansion of existing programs that the FDA's, I think, been really quite successful about, whether it's assisting the rare disease community to better understand the regulatory process, evidence generation, et cetera. There's been, a good amount of webinars that I've watched through the years on small business assistance, et cetera. Do you know or have any suggestions for existing kind of education programs that the FDA might be able to utilize, expand upon, et cetera? And I know we've got some folks in the room here from FDA that are tied into rare diseases, et cetera, but any thoughts for the practical kind of advising or educating for nonprofits that don't necessarily have access to a Hyman Phillips attorney, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, I think, is this on? I think it's a little challenging because
your association with FDA really begins when you are the sponsor. That's when most of your conversations start happening, and they're through formal meetings. So I think there would have to be some sort of, I guess, I don't know if it would be outreach or some sort of effort, at least from FDA, to really envelop the nonprofit sponsors into the existing framework. Something about the way you have conversations with FDA would have to change, or FDA would have to be proactive in having these kinds of conversations. Like right now, if you are a putative sponsor and you want to have a meeting with FDA, you have to go through these meeting packages that are in briefing books that are incredibly time consuming to write. And they're incredibly important for FDA, so it makes sense. But when you're just starting out and you're a nonprofit sponsor, it's really hard for you to understand how to do that if you don't have access to a regulatory consultant or attorney that can help you. So I think FDA is going to have to be proactive and try to do something to amend the system that it currently has to do something specifically for nonprofit sponsors. I just don't think that under the current framework, there's something that can work right now.
Devin, anything from you on that topic?
Perhaps just to add that nonprofits are not explicitly excluded from being sponsors in the current framework, but rather, given that we don't intend to manufacture the drugs or bring a new product to market, we don't have the materials that would typically go into the briefing book to start that conversation. And so even though we have the evidence or the will to be running these clinical trials, going into a pre-IND is already a huge barrier when you don't have all of the components for it.
Fair. Yeah, those are all good points. And I guess, the construct of is also challenging for, say, CROs, for tech companies, for patient groups, kind of also similarly talk about the difficulty and based on the construct of sponsors engaging with FDA, and that's kind of about it. So, okay, so one of the things that the team is definitely going to take away is working with others here on ideas for other mechanisms for engagement to kind of help that kind of bridging gap. Anything in the terms of anything you could suggest for development of substantial evidence? You talk about the various ranges, say for a rare disease drug, for say classically two RCTs. There's certainly guidances out there about substantial evidence, et cetera. But again, that kind of linked to really being able to design trials, develop evidence that would meet the standard, even if you didn't have, say, CMC data, et cetera. Any thoughts there?
So we have seen examples of drugs that were repurposed by academics, and then those clinical trials came to the FDA. And it was through a partnership with the manufacturer, I believe. So midazolam, the effort was predominantly pushed forward by BARDA, and they were taking some RCT data from an academic. And what we found was that they had to reanalyze the data when the manufacturer became involved, and then once again when the FDA became involved, because it was done outside of the IND. And so I think there are some ways that we can streamline this, as well as working with manufacturers if there are pharma-sponsored trials that they have no intention of pursuing. Gaining access to some of that really critical data would be wonderful, as well as finding new pockets for funding, such what Jana had mentioned with translational science, if there's a way to tap into that.
Please, yeah.
Yeah, Janet Woodcock, private citizen. Yeah, one of the issues is that it isn't quite regulatory grade. I mean, the what the agency needs is data they can rely upon, okay, that provides confidence. It isn't like there's a certain formula that you have to pertain to. So this is back to my former theme. I once told Harold Varmus, when he was head of NIH, that they did small, crappy trials. All right. And he wasn't happy, but he looked into it, and so did Francis Collins, and they improved. But they are still underpowered, inadequate trials. And so one of the problems with the investigator-sponsored research is it is not robust. It's too small, it's too underfunded, its databases are, in their drawer and so forth. Yeah, so, or non-existent or whatever, and they just put the data together by hand. So really, I think if you want, there are a lot of these trials that go on, a large number of them, okay, investigator initiated, and they're funded by NIH. So, I think continuing to push on what I pushed on for 10 12 years, okay, that they improve the quality of oversight and that, those trials that are funded be, why would you do human research if it's not going to, lead to advancement of something? Okay, I'll tell you why. So you get a line on your CV for your promotion committee, okay? But that is not a good enough reason for people to sacrifice their time to be, experimented on. So I think that's something to keep in mind, that where do these somewhat inadequate trials come from? And how are they allowed to proceed?
Okay. Helpful, thank you.
And then sometimes the trials themselves aren't necessarily inadequate, but if you're looking at published literature, for instance, it's the reporting that's inadequate, or the access to the data that's inadequate, because you need to have the patient level data often in order to get efficacy approval.
Right, but what you should require if you have government funding of a study is those data should be made available for different uses.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. But it is hard to find that patient level data. It's hard to get access to it. So it makes it really challenging to get published literature approved.
There's a reason for that.
It's been structured to not be shared. Okay, fair. Well, maybe sticking with kind of incentives and data sharing in that regard. David, I almost asked you in the previous session, you talked about obviously building off of the great work from NCAT structuring data, et cetera, but the need to have additional data sets provided all the time and access to results. Any kind of incentive mechanisms that you all in the room have successfully achieved in order to build data sets, et cetera, so there is more access to that true patient data that can be reported out? Any kind of sponsor incentive ideas that have worked or sadly continue not to at all?
Happy to share the comment. So David Feigenbaum, Every Cure. When we first started Every Cure, David Feigenbaum. When we first started Every Cure, we assumed that companies would be willing to donate their data if it's no cost to them. If the data is already available, they'll donate it to us, and that has not yet been proven to be the case. Maybe we just haven't done a good enough job, and there are companies out there, and if you're listening, I hope you will donate your data to us. But I do think it's been harder than I anticipated, and part of it probably goes back to Janet's point around sometimes the data was just never intended to be shared publicly or in other forums. But unfortunately, I haven't seen the same sort of sharing that I was hoping. We're a nonprofit here to repurpose drugs. Sure, people are going to donate data to us, but that hasn't been the case.
Yeah, one thing we're thinking of too is if you were, as the nonprofit, to run a beautiful, adequate clinical trial and hand it to the RLD on a silver platter, would they take it on? Even though there's no incentive structure, no profits on the other side, all of the work leading up to that has been done. But in truth, there's still liability that they would be taking on expanding out their indication. And there's all of the additional regulatory work that would go involved in that. So if you have an advocate there who is able to take this on as a passion project, it may be possible. But bringing them to the table, even when you have all of the evidence in front of you, is incredibly difficult.
The promise of 3-year exclusivity is not that valuable, because once the indication or the product has been approved with a single indication, you can carve out that second indication, and so you can if you're automatically substitutable, then it doesn't matter that you don't have that carved out indication. So it's that 3-year exclusivity, while a great idea, is not as valuable as it might seem.
Yeah.
Particularly, I think the issue of patents came up as well. And method of use patents are one area that really come up in repurposing in terms of if you're able to allocate just that specific indication. But with generics being rated for substitution, even at the pharmacy level, patients may not know which version they're going to receive. And when it's prescribed without any indication specific information, you're going to have instances of skinny labeling regardless of what your patent says.
So, completely agree with the challenges identified. can we pivot or maybe stick with it just slightly to the liability concerns that you talk about in your proposal and kind of this idea of a third party, the use of a third party mechanism. Have you gotten so far as to thinking through how operationalizing it would occur? Any interesting parties that you all have engaged with? Anything you could share there?
It is pretty early stages. So this is something we're still seeking input on in terms of how it could be structured. But I think we're looking towards CROs and CDMOs that are a more centralized faction for this, but something that could be more accessible to nonprofits, where otherwise it could be quite cost prohibitive, because part of why we're not seeing pharmaceutical companies getting in this is it's really expensive and there's no profit on the other side.
Okay, thanks so much. One of the questions from the audience, and maybe it's not a perfect link to this session, but let's go ahead and link it in now, and see if that helps with this idea of submissions, adequate data, labeling updates. The question is about real world data and how it could be leveraged. There are obviously groups leaning heavily into real world data as an alternative to controlled trials. Have either of you seen opportunities to utilize real world data for labeling expansions utilized by nonprofits or non-traditional developers?
I have never seen a non-traditional developer or sponsor, or rather nonprofit sponsor actually come to FDA. I'm not at FDA, so I wouldn't, know, but I've never had a non-traditional client come up with an idea like that, so I can't say.
No, it's a different question.
There are instances of real world evidence being used to support labeling changes. I think there's still few and far between, especially for indication expansions. And what I have seen is usually in patient populations, such as moving to pediatrics or going from just breast cancer in women to breast cancer in men. So I think using it as confirmatory evidence is really feasible, but we need to see the real world evidence program develop further before it's really applicable for hard repurposing cases.
It's only really been the last couple of years that FDA has really started to be open to real world evidence and publishing guidances and things like that. So I think it's going to be a little bit of time before we really see any dependence or reliance on this.
Janet, then Amy?
Yeah, Janet Woodcock. I would say, we saw some presentations of some cases where basically the people were going to die and then they picked up their bed and walked and they were cured. Okay, these are compelling cases where actually maybe some of them were done under IND, some of them were because of wasn't approved in the United States, where I think one case like that doesn't make a story, but for 5 cases,
and you have as substantial evidence as you would have from a clinical trial. All right, but that's one end of the spectrum. As I think Heather said, most treatments aren't going to be like that. You have to do a causal inference. And there you have to have some kind of design that enables reliable causal inference. And so for efficacy, don't forget different efficacy supplements. Some of them may be for tens of thousands of patients that the large pharma does. Others will be for these onesies or twosies or rare diseases. And so there is this sliding scale of how much, what's needed for substantial evidence. I think for safety, if the product has been used off-label a lot in that disease, then it helps to give you a safety database and the confidence. But on the end of the spectrum where you're talking about smaller effects and not an inevitable disease course, then to get to causal inference from just real world evidence, what you're talking about with pediatrics or related populations is actually extrapolation. And that, that's certainly feasible and a lot easier. So I think although you need to collect all the evidence you can, you have to realize that you're not going to be totally convincing if these are smaller treatment effects.
Yeah. smaller treatment effects and smaller numbers has been such a challenge, in general, but particularly here. Amy?
Thanks, Amy Rick, FDA. Can you confirm for me that this framework you're thinking about would apply only to nonprofits?
So we have structured it, and it's still in the proposal phase.
Yeah.
More towards non-manufacturers. I think there's an open question in terms of how you could really restrict that to just nonprofits and ensure that you're not opening the floodgates to groups who are just looking for this as another line to add to their CV.
Yeah, well, also, and I do kind of hesitate to ask this question because I love out of the box, innovative, I'm all for it. But I do worry a little bit of going down the road, even though non-traditional sponsors, as you indicate, it's not occurred very much, to start defining an appropriate sponsor in this case, but the nonprofit for a particular framework could be manipulated pretty easily by, creating a 501c3 and relying on something similar to an IRS status makes me really nervous for a pathway or a framework. And it also, but again, think out of the box, innovative. I don't mean to be a naysayer, but I also worry that it might have a ricochet effect on manufacturers, that they would have less incentive, or they might sell, it might turn into a voucher thing where there's some, I don't know. I just feel like that there's some rule of unintended consequences by starting to define what entity can use a particular admittedly lenient but needed pathway. And if it might be better to think about a substantial need and a drug that is not being fully utilized, that kind of thing, but not IRS or legal status of the organization.
I would love to connect after this.
Very thoughtful, thank you. I should have reminded right at the start of the session, we do have a poll that's open. We've got one of them for each of these sessions, so you can see kind of our highlighted boxes here is what we've identified as kind of approval ideas that have come out through the research. If folks online can please ensure that you're kind of submitting prioritization votes, we're going to capture that for each of our sessions and kind of work that into our outputs. We've got a little over 5 minutes left in the session. I've got another question that came in online. Devin, this one was addressed to you, but I'm gonna kind of put it out to everybody so that you're not too much on the spot here. It has to do with basically costs and time. The common reference is $2.8 billion, 10 years for a new drug. Not talking about that. We're talking about generic repurposing. The question that was sent to you is, do you have a rough sense of costs, time and financial, required to take a drug through the 505(b)(2) approval in addition to the application fees? Get that that's a lot because it's going to take a different amount of time and data to generate evidence depending on therapeutic area, but any sense of range, examples, et cetera, open up to you both and certainly anybody else in the room.
In the current framework, or either labeling only or the 505(b)(2), I'm not sure that there is a huge discrepancy between what a nonprofit would do and the traditional sponsor, except for the actual development component of manufacturing the drug. So that's the best I can say for that. But it would be incredibly costly in order to run the trial, which could be, 5 to 20 million, then adding on the PDUFA and the annual reporting as well. And all of the internal considerations, bringing in legal expertise, bringing in the review staff, preparing the packages, et cetera.
Anything to add?
Yeah, that concords with my experience.
Any other questions from the audience? If not, I'm going to jump into product liability stuff for just a final question or two. David, and then Leonard in the back. Oh, my job is done here.
Just a quick one, Dave Hageman, over here, just a quick question around citizens petition. You mentioned citizens petition, and I think that some of this could be considered in the framework of citizens petition, you know, whether you're a nonprofit or just a group of citizens. Maybe you can comment on how often citizens petition is used, and if we could just use the existing ability to do that, like could we just be a group of citizens that's applying for adalimumab for DATA2 syndrome, for example?
Well, the citizen petition process is used to ask the agency to do something, to take some action. You can't really go for approval under a citizen petition, but what you're doing is you ask FDA if this pathway to consider making this pathway, for instance. But the problem with citizen petitions, especially now after all the RIFs, is that there are very few people left to respond to them. In general, it takes a very long time to have FDA respond to your petition, but a lot of the people who are responsible for responding to petitions were so it is very challenging to get a response to your citizen petition. And that's even before the RIFs, it was challenging to get a real substantive response. But you couldn't go try to get approval through a citizen petition process if that's what you're asking.
And I maybe heard from the wrong person, that you could apply through citizens.
You could apply for permission to do a suitability petition, which means that you are making some change to an ANDA. So you're making, and it doesn't apply to indication. So you could say, like, you wanted to get a new prescription for Adderall, you wanted to do a new dosage form. You could submit to FDA a suitability petition asking FDA if that's okay to submit it in an ANDA. And FDA would say yes or no, but you can't use it for a new indication, and you can't use it for a biologic either, which is significant because a lot of products are biologics.
It sounds similar to what we're seeing in the EU with Article 48 in terms of the nonprofit being a champion for a repurposed generic and coming to the EMA with a data package or a suggestion for an indication that they would then turn around and request that what their equivalent of the RLD add to their label. And I think what we'll hear later on in terms of modern, there's also that within statute to allow the FDA to change labels on generics. If modern were implemented, having room for public comment or a way for nonprofits to help point out which drugs might benefit from label changes could be an avenue for that. But it may require an expansion on modern, first to include more types of drugs. Right now it's restricted to generics where the RLD has left the market, which is a very limited subset, as well as opening more discussion from the public.
And what's interesting is the agency currently has authority to mandate that the RLD make safety changes under 50504, but there's no mechanism by which the agency can mandate that they make efficacy changes. So the FDA can't demand that you change the indication to add a new indication to your labeling, but they can demand that you put liver failure on your label.
Two gentlemen in the back.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the sessions. Oscar Cano, Cardinal Consultings. My question is regarding the existence of any reliable artificial intelligence or machine learning solutions that could help supporting nonprofits through either clinical trials, data management, regulatory submissions, documentation preparation, or so on. And if not, how viable it is for nonprofits and small business to develop that type of support.
At RebuilderX, we are using AI currently on the discovery portion, so identifying the most promising drugs that we want to bring forward for patients. And it's very feasible, I think, given the trajectory of AI and machine learning over the past few years, that is something that could help reduce some of the costs and oversights. It's not something that we've specifically looked into, but it's a great idea. And I think you would still need the human in the loop just to ensure, but absolutely a option for minimizing the costs.
And do appreciate the differentiation between, say, the AI for drug discovery portion versus AI for development of regulatory submission, kind of administrative components. Administrative, probably not the right word, but we've definitely got some work here at Margolis on both sides of the AI utilization components. Leonard, one last with you.
Thanks very much, Leonard Sachs from FDA. I just wanted to get back to the previous theme, which is the need for big clinical studies in these areas of unmet need and not having the wherewithal. And I think there seem to be two different groups of problems that we're dealing with. Let me just sort of set up the ecosystem. The problem here is the regulatory system is set up such that a sponsor comes in, develops a drug with a purpose of making a profit. FDA is an impartial arbiter. They decide whether the drug works, and then the company makes all its money off the profits of the drug. The watershed we're stuck in, and the regulatory system that doesn't support it, is that we've taken away the profit piece. It's gone. So what else keeps these people coming? Not very much. And I think that's where, I'm curious to hear a bit more about what puts the wind in the sails of nonprofits. But that is an aside issue. I think the two different sort of areas that we're kind of looking at challenges, and they're slightly different, are the types of drugs where you need a big study. Now that's an unusual thing, because if you need a big study, the sense is there's a large patient population and probably there is a potential marketing advantage. It falls away with old generic drugs. I mean, the drug that comes to mind is aspirin. Aspirin as an anti-inflammatory or something else. I mean, nobody would go and do an exorbitant trial for profit to prove that it's good to prevent stroke. So that's the aspirin model. But on the other side, I think we have to recognize that there is an area which is the watershed, because the diseases are rare and there's no profit margin there. And in that area, I don't think you need enormous trials. I think you need wherewithal, know-how, scientific sort of strategy and so on. So maybe it's worth just thinking that in this area where the profit motive falls away, there are trials which don't need to be big or cannot be big because there are not enough patients to participate, and there are trials which do need to be big, and there are different business problems.
Yeah, I think we all appreciate the call out there, right? Small patients, diminishing patient groups, use of internal controls, external controls. There's a sophisticated amount of understanding, analysis, creation, development of registries, natural histories. These things are also not cheap, right? And they take an enormous amount of acumen. But appreciate the call out because of their highly necessary utility in rare diseases and elsewhere. Okay, we're about at 1 o'clock. A couple of things. One more plug for the poll before we go into the break. We've launched, so we've got a poll for each session based on how the framework is set up. So even if you did respond to the first poll, second poll up there now, and that'll continue through the day. We'll keep that up during lunch. We didn't get much to product liability. Oh, I'm gonna have one final question in the back to product liability. And to be honest, it's been a bit of a struggle for us as we've been doing our research. And I'm not quite sure if it's because it's easy to find lawyers with product liability expertise based on the current construct of sponsors submitting packages, et cetera. But I call out for folks in the room and folks online. If you have particular product liability insights to share, we certainly, that's something that it's a gap we kind of need to fill in order to complete our research. We'll go back to Rick Ball in just a second, but in case I forget, we're going to break for an hour for lunch. So folks online back at 2, folks here, we've got lunch. Use the time to interact. Sure, catch up on emails a little bit, but let's not lose this time together. I miss these in-person meetings. I miss these in-person meetings so much because I feel like we squeeze as much juice offline as we do online. But Rick, one last thing to close us out.
Yeah, Jared, I think it goes right to the liability question. I didn't really understand what the liability question is. Is it you're concerned about liability, clinical trial liability? You're concerned about liability related to patient privacy and under those. What is the liability question that you're asking that you're trying to address? Because I mean, I think we have pretty robust liability protections involving drugs that are cleared. We have the CE process. We have the various, we have, certainly for generics, we have the, there's tons of case law that once it's cleared, there is no product liability unless it's a manufacturing issue.
But if it's a B2, then they're the sponsor. Won't they have some product liability issues like an RLD would have?
Yeah, but they're gonna have this, it's gonna be the same as, yeah, they would, I mean.
I guess it's just,
So is the question is, once it's is the question, do you have concerns about clinical trial liability? Do you have concerns once it's approved what's the liability you're trying to address? Or is it all three of them? Is it all the potential liability?
I think really all of the above, but specifically what we're trying to unpack is being the primary sponsor on a labeling only 505(b)(2) and what that product liability outside of the manufacturing and defects, how that relatively scales compared to what a nonprofit might do otherwise through off-label education initiatives. And taking that on and how, when we're talking about a pharmaceutical company or even a generic manufacturer, it's a different entity in space than the nonprofits.
Did you have anything else? Sorry, one of them for me was, I don't have clarity on the fact of, so manufacturers assume liability based on the indications that they have tied to CMC, et cetera. What happens if an additional indication is added through a non-traditional developer? It's a different patient population, et cetera. Is there an additional liability for that patient group that the sponsor takes on, even though they didn't pursue the indication? And I don't know if that's a real issue or not, but that's one that it keeps coming up.
And as it pertains to adverse event reporting or safety monitoring, if the drug were used in a repurposed indication off-label, that would still fall on the current RLD to monitor. So when you are bringing it into this space, there's additional reporting, which can only benefit patients. But at the same time, who owns that?
Thank you both so much. We'll reconnect back at 2.
So we're gonna get started with the third session, which following along with the theme of these different buckets in our framework, we're gonna talk about updating labels. I think we kind of touched on some of these themes already in the last session. This is kind of a nice segue into this next one, but really this is kind of just more broadly about, are there ways that the regulator could take a more active role in updating drug labels using existing evidence and also to ensure that there's responsible promotion and public health benefit of repurposed drugs? So I'm going to invite Janet Woodcock up, who is going to kick us off the presentation, and then we'll do a little bit of a moderated discussion about this. Janet.
Thank you. Right. Let's see how. You think they can see me at all?
As long as you don't stand around here, you're fine.
Okay. All right. So I'm actually going to talk about this, but I'm going to back up a little. Oh, okay. Thank you. I'm going to back up a little and go over what other people have covered, but with my own different take on it. Okay. So I just talk about regulatory options, facilitate repurposing, evidentiary standards, labeling, so forth. I did want to say I'm on the board of Every Cure, so you might say I'm already on board, so to speak, on this. Okay. So what is the problem? Okay. Repurposing generic drugs, really, we've talked about that, right? But there's no real incentive. Talked about that. So for-profits don't do this, right? Nonprofits lack the resources and they can't navigate the regulatory process, right? Off-label use not reimbursed. Also raises concerns from patients, maybe off-label, okay, and practitioner liability. And also uptake is slow. Uptake is slow already, even for new drugs, and it's slower if this is just by word of mouth and journal articles, okay? Cancer drugs are often repurposed and often get reimbursed. There are special arrangements for cancer. CMS has to pay for cancer drugs if they're in a compendium or whatever. Insurers follow that. And so that, has diffused cancer treatment quicker and allowed reimbursement because much of cancer treatment is still off-label. For regulators, and this is where we get, I get off the beaten path, okay? Drug labels are supposed to be the gold standard, but they often get out of date, particularly once generics are available,
All right. I'll tell you, labels are rarely utilized by practitioners for old drugs. And this is not the party line, but practitioners don't look at old drug labels. All right. They'll look at anything else. Because it's not a good look for the agency. You can't maintain this as a gold standard at the same time have them all get out of date. But that's how it is. Reimbursement, though, is often tied to whether it's on the label, FDA approval, generic drug and new drug review processes, and the user fee programs were put into place with a for-profit industry in mind. We already talked about that. They aren't fit for this type of work. No FDA infrastructure for nonprofit repurposers, and the current label update process, as we've heard in the last session, doesn't fit, right? But I think the lack of infrastructure is important too, because you need people who understand a nonprofit repurpose effort. And it's quite different than what a for-profit company would do to get a label change, in the sense of motivation and all sorts of things. Having a regulatory affairs department, having all this stuff, okay? We talked about this, other regulatory groups or bodies, health bodies, have made sporadic efforts. These haven't done too much, okay, but they have made efforts. In other words, this isn't just a US problem. FDA made sporadic efforts in the past, particularly egregious old generic drug labels. I remember, I'm a rheumatologist. I remember when the FDA had on its own initiative, I believe, long ago, added methotrexate, oral methotrexate to the label, okay, for treatment of rheumatic diseases, for which was very successful, is a standard care now. Okay, but at the time they did it, which was very long ago, people recommended taking a liver biopsy before initiating oral methotrexate. Now this is just like horrendous. And I had nightmares until this got off the label, because I could imagine some rural doctor having to start a patient on who with rheumatoid arthritis on methotrexate and trying to do a liver biopsy, which they also probably did once every 5 years, and and causing severe harm when it wasn't standard care anymore. Same with tricyclic antidepressants. They had incorrect information on resuscitation after overdose in the label. Yeah, and nobody was doing anything about it. So I, of course, raised my hands and got people to do that, but it was few and far between. I'm sure other labels. So the Oncology Center of Excellence had the same issue. Cancer drug, there are lots of cancer drugs, parts of current regimens that are extremely old drugs. And their labels were like completely out of date, okay, had nothing to do with current usage. And so the project renewal was really directed at that. It wasn't really necessarily adding new indications, although that was part of it. It was like overhauling the entire completely outdated label. But it was labor intensive for the agency, and the Oncology Center of Excellence had more resources in most parts of new drugs, and so they were able to do this. And they have the CN, I think, I misspelled it, or other parties that had done a lot of the work and issued guidelines and so forth that they were also able to use, assembled the evidence. So, and the Modern Labeling Act that was already talked about, that has not been used or set up the process. Labor intensive, the FDA was supposed to do this. Okay, that's just another job, okay? And then there's the dreaded appeal process, okay? The agency would do almost anything to avoid the appeal process because it is so, such a time suck for the agency. So that has not been implemented at all. So they would have to issue guidance on how to do it. Non-legislative proposals. And this is where your grid comes in, okay? So the columns. The first column is FDA should try harder. That to me is the first column. That ain't gonna fly, especially in today's situation But even before, as I said, the whole structure of the new drug review process of PDUFA was set up for the, the commercial sponsors in the new drug development, the classic new drug development process. There's nothing hardly left over to do something new like this. Expand the user fee waiver program to exempt, such things. I think that would be actually legislative. I don't think you can just, do that off the spur of the moment. New regulatory pathway, Reboot RX. They want, you heard about that. They believe it could be established by guidance. I think that would be a stretch, probably legally. You could say maybe it could, but I don't think it would. Incentives, they need to be financial. Okay, their incentives going to give somebody a gold star for spending $5 million, right?
Yeah.
To get a new indication on. Probably very few people would sign up for that. So I'm not sure any of those. I'm not sure that whole column or second column really is very viable, but I have some proposals. Okay, so the legislative proposal, we have a haystack project has advocated for the Protect Rare Act, and this would move rare diseases into the cancer realm, okay, and then mandate reimbursement, okay. Now that only deals for the rare diseases, however you define those, right? Expand federal effort on repurposing, such as put some money behind it, or ARPA-H, or a new program at NIH, et cetera. Of course, I'm totally behind that, right, as I've said, but I don't know how feasible. Expand Modern Labeling Act, get rid of the withdrawn FDA requirement and broaden it. Allow submission, not have FDA do all the work. Those are really great ideas, but still I don't think they will achieve our objectives. So you could deal with liability concerns legislatively. You have suggested in the grid international regulatory reciprocity that undermines national sovereignty, and it's a very, very touchy issue. So you can suggest it, but I don't think it'll fly, okay? What I think will work. Well, first of all, you could use the label only 505(b)(2) pathway. Why should nonprofit developers have to have a product when they're FDA-blessed interchangeable products on the market? Makes no sense that we're requiring manufacturing information. You could request commercially sourced samples if the indication had some special thing about the presentation that, you had to look at the actual product, but that's very uncommon. But here's what I think we should do, okay? I think we could accept citizen petition submissions with evidence of safety and effectiveness. We could then evaluate that evidence, and if it was deemed, if the product was deemed, the product writ large was deemed safe and effective for that indication, we could post a notice in the Federal Register, and we could say the product was found to be safe and effective for this indication, attach the analysis of the data and a draft label. Companies could put this in their label. They could incorporate that indication or not. But for insurance purposes, work with CMS and make it clear to the entire world, this is approved for this indication. What would that do? That would remove the concern about liability, because now, as I was telling Julie, I'm not sure the lawyers feel comfortable about that, right? But there wouldn't be, a generic wouldn't have to assume liability unless they put that on their label. Each company would still have to do the pharmacovigilance, everything they do now for their product. And reimbursement, which is what we are considering, would be available because this would be deemed FDA approved. Now, FDA would have to be very clear. This has been done. It was done, I don't know, when would you do that, Marta, for buprenorphine?
December last year
December of last year, this was done.
was
Oh.
clarification of a label.
Clarification of the label, but it's the same, right? There are multiple buprenorphines on the market. It was just published in the Federal Register as a finding and so forth. This could be the program. Would have to have a data submission process. Submitters could refer the Orange Book drugs that have a USP monograph for the CMC. They wouldn't have to submit any talks or anything like that, or have a right of reference. Because if the FDA's already said these are all equivalent and there's a USP monograph, like what else do you want? No, do you have to prove it again when we already said it was true to ourselves? I don't think so. ANDA holders, could continue to current post-market. And I think this would help with the liability concerns, although some people, our lawyer colleagues, many of them in the room always want to have somebody to sue. I guess you could sue the government, right? So basically, though, I think that we should get away from the idea of a 505(b)(2) or other type of submission entirely, because that is something for the commercial sponsors to use. It was set up for them and it has those strengths and has those liabilities. But to add indications for the intent of treating patients, this another pathway, I think, could be suitable. Now, what I've told people as we were talking about this is that I don't believe this is sustainable as an initiative. It's kind of like that first column, try harder, right? But if the individuals, if this could be done a few times, demonstrate a remarkable success in saving the lives of citizens, and then providing low cost, life-saving treatments to people, I believe you could then try to talk people into a program. That program could be shared with NCATS and the FDA and actually could turn into more of a machine, because I have been impressed by the stories. I didn't think there would be so many, but to have but a relatively so far cursory effort, right? Yeah. I mean, between David, between Heather and Leonard and so forth, it's not as if we're mounting a worldwide effort. Now the AI project has given all this list, but they haven't all been proven yet. But what it shows us, you wouldn't find that many if it were a rare occurrence. What it showed us is this is the tip of the iceberg for repurposing. There are lots and lots of drugs out there that could treat all these thousands of currently untreatable diseases, or better treat diseases that have unsatisfactory treatment now. So that's what I think, and I'm happy to answer questions or what have you.
All right, thank you so much, Jan. It was really great. It was great to hear your proposal too, because that was my first time hearing it, and very interesting. So I wonder if maybe we want to start with questions. It sounds like we already have some hands in the audience for Janet about that. And then we'll still have our slide open if you guys want to submit some questions online. I'll be monitoring that as well. But Devin, I saw your hand first. You want to start?
Sure. So, thank you.
Hi, it's Devin Crittenden from Repurposing. So I'm curious about the value of the information being posted by the FDA versus actually enacted on the label. Because when you do have that labeling, there are certain ripple effects through coding, through triggering NCCN and insurance. And you had spoken to, you need CMS on board in order to really enact this. But I mean, by definition, what would be FDA approval versus FDA informed?
Well, I think you could make this FDA approval. We approved like OTC drugs with monographs in the past, and now we approve them with orders. Okay. Well, devices are cleared, not necessarily approved. So this is FDA endorsed as a safe and effective therapy. And I think that would, you're right, though, that will be part of this, which is to convince the reimbursement community, okay, that, in fact, this is an FDA approval. This is approval. It is a finding of safety and effectiveness. That's what would be posted, which is the statutory requirement. So, but sure, somebody could quibble about that, but are they really gonna quibble about a drug for $1.70? I mean, it's different than the new drug review process where it might be $11,000 a month, okay? And there's a lot of quibbling about that. So Marta, what has been the experience with buprenorphine, do you know, as far as reimbursement?
It's part of an ongoing discussion. Again, it's been, for instance, recognized in CMS documentation that the reimbursement of buprenorphine, especially in that situation, was regarding the highest dose, was considered, the way it was framed in the label was considered as dose limited, even though it was by FDA deemed as misinterpretation. So we've been working with CMS to clarify and improve a system based on the FRN, referencing the FRN rather than the label, or adding to the clarification to the label that it's not meant to be a dose limit, hence higher doses could be reimbursed. So this is one example where we've been doing it, and the key component is actually engaging very closely with CMS and clarifying why, maybe it's still not on the label, but it's already the FDA review and decision is posted in the public forum. So it's a process because it's not the usual thing, how it's being done, but it's definitely possible to
And I think
engage with them.
that would be part of the effort, is to adjust those things, those codings or what have you. You know, the insurers want to know that something's FDA approved. And sure, maybe they look at labels or what have you. I'm not sure what they do about labels that are like 30 years old though, okay. But I think those things are not insuperable obstacles to this. Yeah, we've done this before. FDA has posted findings of safety and effectiveness before. I wish I could remember the products, but I can't offhand.
I see there's a question in the back, Giuseppe.
Thanks. Yep. Thank you, Janet. Hi, Giuseppe Randazzo, Association for Accessible Medicines. I think most of you guys know we represent generic and biosimilar manufacturers. So I guess the question would be, first of all, it's fascinating. This whole just today, and the objective is fascinating. And I think if you're not rooting for this, you might be soulless. So I applaud all your hands. I applaud all your hands. I would say, and I think, of course, we'll get to it later, the incentive piece, which is down the road. But for me, I guess one little thing, an issue, Jan, with yours is, I think might be a little different than Marta's example with OTC. I think you might want to tweak that because there might have to be a regulatory or legislative fix as well, because I don't think you can give the option, I could be wrong, I don't think you give the options for generics to use this labeling suggestion or change, because you can't have 10 generics out there, 4 or 5 with a different label than the other 4 or 5. As far as I understand the regulations, from a generic perspective, has to be the same as RLD, and they have to be the same. It's a very small regulation. I think it's less than a page, but that's my understanding of generic labeling. So that would be one thing to have to address.
Right, but isn't that, they would have to do the 505(b)(2) pathway in reference.
They would, but if that's but if the 505(b)(2) is RLD, they have to make the change to their label.
Yeah.
That's my understanding.
Oh, no, I mean, if they want to add it to their label, they would have to go the 505(b)(2) pathway.
I'd have to look into that more. I don't know if.
Yeah, and that's then would start invoking all the liabilities we have talked about, which are everything, liability, but mainly the costs, the ongoing costs under the 505(b)(2) program.
So one more thing to think about that is if the 505(b)(2) is an RLD, and if they don't have to make this change, and if you're giving them the option, what if 4 of the 10 marketed products choose to make the change and the other 6 do not. I don't think you're allowed to have that in the market. I could be wrong.
I think so, because
Oh.
you could get another, you could do a 505(b)(2).
Yeah.
Okay, and get,
But that's a different pathway. That's not a can.
yeah, but so that, this would be a different pathway. You can't do it under an ANDA.
Right.
But you could add it under a 505(b)(2) to your label.
Yeah. It's a problem. I mean, all of this was set up for a certain kind of thing. Commercial sponsor does this. Generic sponsor does that. Okay, everything was set up for that. We're deviating from that. But don't forget, I'm the person, I got biosimilars, right? I got the OTC switch from a monograph.
Right.
To, which was gonna take 100 years, okay, to get them all done, right? Switch to orders, okay? So you can make changes. People don't like it, it's uncomfortable, but it is necessary. So that's why.
Great point. Okay, we have a couple more hands. So Rick and then Leonard.
Rick Paul, Dwayne Morris, would you do this, this is a purely administrative law question, would you do this, to notice and comment? And you publish and people would have the opportunity to comment and then you would issue the final order?
I would hate to do that, but we would probably have to do it.
Leonard, I saw your hand up.
I would consider it a finding of like, if we got legislation, it'd be better to do an order. Right?
Yeah, I agree with that, but
Yeah,
I think,
but we need legislation to issue orders for this.
I think
type
you
of-
probably have to do it through notice and comment right now.
Right now, and that's, we're paying in the world behind, right?
Yeah, I wanted to raise something which probably goes back before my time. But the DESI model is something that we haven't really spoken about, and it was an authority that gave us as FDA an opportunity to spy in on the scientific value of a product and so on. And it seems to be similar challenge, at least we seem to be faced with a similar challenge now. It was a systematic program. Have you any thoughts about that? I mean, I know too little about it.
Okay, what I think honestly we shouldn't do is do something that is perceived, particularly by all my critics, as a lower standard of efficacy and safety, because we don't need to do that, in my opinion. DESI was clearly a review of extant information and a finding, right? And that was good at the time because we had this huge bulk. But I don't think that would stand up like for reimbursement and everything. That we're doing notice and comment. We get comments from all the insurance companies saying that data were not sufficient. So my theory is we need to be able to say with a straight face, we're maintaining the substantial evidence standard and the safety standard, which is all tests reasonably applicable. That those bars have not changed, but the process has simply changed.
Yeah, so I'm curious about the extent of the generalizability of this, because you're speaking to both changes within the system, but then it not being sustainable. In part, I think citizens petitions, and Sarah might be able to say this more, often fall on deaf ears or are shuffled around a few departments and requiring a full review on submitting the safety and efficacy data. I hear that there are a few examples of this passing through, but it seems like it would be limited to a handful of use cases.
Okay, so, right now, if you submit, a 505(b)(2), you're gonna have to pay all this money, okay, and then they'll do it.
Yeah.
Right, because it's under the agreements, right? But we already said, I don't think the nonprofits can be,
It doesn't make a lot of sense to be giving all this money. The citizen petitions, most of them are blocking petitions. Some of them are like far left petitions. Some of them are far right wing petitions. See, they do take a lot of time, okay? But this, what I'm saying is if we can demonstrate success, we could set up a program to do this. So those citizen petitions would go right to the program. And that's what the program would do. They would review that evidence or reject it, or, you know, if they felt it was too scanty to spend a lot of time on or whatever, but they'd have a process. But before we have that process, what we need to do is convince people that we need a process, all right, a new process that isn't the current process. So That's why I would do a bunch of test cases if the agency is willing to, and usually they are. I mean, who's going to say, Heather, that children with amoebas in their brain shouldn't get best treatment, okay? And so forth. So, but it isn't sustainable. You're right. It's not sustainable. But don't think about the current processes because that's not what we're thinking about.
And so I guess we just, for myself, just to kind of summarize what you've been proposing, to me, it sounds really similar to the Article 48 proposal from Europe, where basically anyone can kind of come up with this like package of data to submit to FDA or in that case, the EMA. And then, but instead of in that case where they would go to the sponsor or the other market authorization holders, they would say, and ask them if they're labeled, there'd just be the separate pathway where FDA would say this is approved. So is that correct? If characterize it like that, so
That
it was
is
like
correct.
this whole new program very similar to that. Okay, that's helpful for me. Hopefully that helps some other people in the room too. Cool that model. Are there other questions specifically about? I think I see one hand right here.
Yeah, I can. So I'm a health policy reporter with Inside Health Policy.
Yeah, so just to follow up on the safety and efficacy comment, FDA Commissioner pitched a new customized approval pathway for rare disease drugs that would allow faster access based on a plausible mechanism for drugs effect, like a conditional basis. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
I am not in a position to comment because a plausible pathway could encompass a very large amount of things. I don't know what the specifics might be.
I'll take a couple more questions and then I do want to get to some of the other things we have on here. Yeah. So I saw a hand here and on the back, and then we'll try to pivot to some other things that we have here in the table.
Hi, Rosalie Hoyle, Appalachian Health. I know we've been talking primarily in the context of drugs, but I'm curious of how this could apply to biologics, given that we don't have a 505(b)(2) equivalent in biologics and we're dealing with biosimilars and what that might look like.
Yeah, I think it could look actually rather the same. I'm not totally, I mean, I was deputy director of CBER for a while, a very long time ago, but I don't think their regulations have changed that much, okay? I don't think there's any, we're not utilizing the 505(b)(2) pathway here. So we're creating a new way of indicating FDA approvals. So I think it could apply to the biologics as well.
Okay, and then there's a question in the back corner
there. All right.
Dave Fox from Hogan Levels, and I'm also pro bono advisory council to Reboot RX. And no, it's a really great discussion, and I think we all kind of want to get to the same place. And the place we want to get to is collecting the data and then having it reviewed by the experts at FDA and having them make a judgment. That's the goal.
No.
And I think Janet, so your way of looking at it, what you're putting on the table, is one kind of process choice. And then the other process choice is through the approval pathway.
Correct.
And I think with the citizen petition process, it's first of all, it's completely open-ended. FDA that never has to respond to the petition. So you don't, it's a black hole process. The review process is a black box process. That's its own situation, but pick your poison. But if you go on the citizen petition process, first of all, it's completely open-ended and there's no structure around it. And then even if you can get reviewers to engage, and this would be off the books because it's not within the user fee system, you then still have to graduate to a federal register notice, which is a whole nother process. And you have to have enough, and then at the end of the day, you're getting something which is just, not just, but we have to educate people about what the value is of the federal register notice finding, because it wouldn't be applied to the labeling. You wouldn't get, and we can talk about the technical questions about labeling uptake. So you have sort of three process things you're introducing. And then you have the worry about institutionalizing that because the commitment to that process could change depending on who's in charge from day to day. So those are my concerns. I agree, you know, you could create kind of an open call for data. That's the DESI process. The DESI process was a call for data. And then the National Academy of Sciences set up about 12 different committees to review that data. And by the way, I say this is not about the evidentiary standard. We want the agency to apply whatever the appropriate evidentiary standard is to this data. We just need to find a way to get the data in front of them. So what you're suggesting is kind of a mini sort of call for data that can be submitted through the petition vehicle, but still it always runs up against the problem. Who at the agency is going to devote the time to really analyze it and have back and forth? It's not just a one-way you submit and then FDA looks at it and makes a decision. You want to have information requests, you want to have dialogue. So the reason that, you know, we've been looking at that is try to use the more direct pathway. So instead of using the long way around the block, the express pathway is the review pathway, and see what we can do to clean up the review pathway or optimize it for nonprofit submitters. I think that there are opportunities to be more flexible in user fee waivers for public interest waivers, fees exceed the cost waivers. So there's room there, and that's one place where we probably have more room for legislative change within the user fee cycles to change the waiver basis. So I think the user fees would be manageable. The nonprofit, if it were to get a labeling only B2 approval, would immediately withdraw their NDA or discontinue the NDA. So it would go on the discontinued list, which I think would obviate the need for them to pay ongoing program fees. But then there would be an FDA label, and it would look like a label, right? Nobody would know how to use it. There would be no requirement, and there is no requirement that the generic adopt that labeling. So in terms of the liability analysis, product liability analysis, there is no difference in the two systems. And in fact, I think there's more cover for product liability when the drug is being dispensed under a label, under there's whole body of product liability law, than under an FDA Federal Register notice, which would be open territory for plaintiffs' lawyers. So I think driving towards a label, putting it into a process that has a beginning and an end and a whole choreography to it is, I recognize there are, you know, things that FDA would need to do to be more flexible to accommodate this situation. And the last thing I would note is there are provisions under the existing regulations for relying on USP monographs as the source of CMC. There's an express provision in 31450 for allowing that. And the last part is this occurs all of the time when device companies are developing devices for instilling a drug in a novel way. The protocols usually say use any USP grade generic version of the drug. It doesn't specify the particular drug, and FDA authorizes that under IND protocols all of the time. And that's really all this. We're just taking that and saying just transfer that same thinking onto the NDA. So there are no perfect answer here, and we should all work together. But I think can we clean up the review process a little bit? And a little bit is an overstatement, I'm sorry. But can we clean up the review process and try hard to at least exhaust the possibility of using our existing really well-oiled machinery that you developed for reviewing data to do this?
Right, well, what you're proposing is moving the 505(b)(2) process, at least for these types of submissions, much closer to what I'm talking about. I agree with you. I don't think a citizen petition process would be the end goal. But I think to do a number of those early, if the agency is willing, could then lead the way for some reforms, either of the 505(b)(2) process or a de novo process that is fit for purpose for this objective that we have, okay, which does not include all the stuff that was put in there for the commercial. So you're right. I mean, if you could get all the waivers, my experience when Jane was there, okay, when getting waivers on different types of user fees, it was extremely difficult. But I don't know what the situation is right now. So, we're not that far off. Okay, you're saying you trust the established process right now because it compels compels the agency, because they've gotten a fee, or it's within a fee program, even if the fee wasn't paid. It compels them to do the review within a certain time frame. Okay, what I'm saying is a lot of these, like amoebas in the brain and everything, the people there are doctors, they're going to want to, for these very compelling, like for life-saving, cancer treatment and everything, they're gonna want to get the information out there. So, and I don't know which is the best, where the, if, because, the, currently, the sponsors, the nonprofit sponsors, are gonna have to cough up the user fee potentially for some of these, the submission user fee. Maybe not, because there are a lot of exemptions for first-time submitters and nonprofits and all this kind of stuff, so they might, it might be doable under those, but it's a lot of bureaucracy, to prepare the package compared to, just sending in the data, which is really all we all care about, right? We don't care about all this other stuff that has to be in there, so, very much, at least I don't have, so, but no, I don't disagree with you, I'm not arguing with reboot, I said, on my slide, I agree with that proposal too, I think those are too feasible. Asking FDA to try harder, it's just not gonna fly right now, so we just need to kind of get over it, I think.
And I appreciate it too, that you are using our framework in your slide as well, but then categories. And so one question I have too is, where you think this new idea proposal would fit in as far as the different columns? Like, would this be something that you think would require legislative action? I think using the citizens petition option now would be maybe like building on current processes, but then will creating something new maybe fall under a new legislation kind of pathway?
That's correct. I mean, I usually think kind of strategically, what do we do to get this started, get attention, get momentum? You have to start somewhere that's doable, and then you build to, but you should have your objective in mind. What are you building towards? Not just kind of blindly keep doing the same thing. We need to build toward a program that, which is, what was being, what David was saying. We can't just rely upon random goodwill over time. It's not gonna work. People are too busy. But we can't start with a program, so we don't have a program.
Right. And then just to kind of revisit the modern labeling act, I know like you kind of packaged that a little bit into the Try Hard FDA, but I wonder like if there is kind of a pathway like linking a little bit of what you were describing with the modern labeling act, where groups like Reboot RX or other nonprofits, academics could submit data to support that label base. It's not all putting the burden on FDA, but I guess there's still a question of maybe ownership or resources of FDA. So I'm maybe just curious, like picking your brain a little bit on the possibilities of implementing what's already there and maybe using that as kind of starting point to get momentum to other things.
Sure, if you had the RLD withdrawn, which is one of the criteria, you could probably use that framework to get started too, rather than give a citizen petition, okay? Although the Modern Labeling Act itself seems to mainly consider that the FDA just gathers all this data up somehow miraculously and does all the work. Okay, I will remind you, I mean, once I did a hearing before Congress, and a member sitting bench up there told me the FDA has no business communicating with consumers. So my point is, there's a wide, FDA's mission is very constrained in many congressional minds to, okay, you should just sit there, you're just review stuff. You shouldn't be proactive at all, and you don't need to communicate at all. Now, other members already think differently, but it's in congressional record, that's what was said to me, no business communicating with consumers. So my point is, we're gonna have to build a case of why this benefits the public.
Janet, can I follow up on that? I think that point cannot be sorry.
Amy Rick, not admitting them from the FDA for what I'm about to say. I think that point cannot be overstated, that the historical traditional role of the FDA was to accept applications from sponsors, and their relationship is with the sponsor. And a big piece of what we're talking about is shifting an acceptance and actually an embracing of all the parties and communities that are actually part of this. But also in my view, and I'm curious whether you agree with this phrasing, Janet, is the public health role and responsibility of FDA to not be passive and always wait for the sponsor to be basically in charge, except for the accept and reject role of the FDA. And so I think even when we're talking about traditional processes, FDA will often say about sponsors, come early, come often, come talk to us. But there's nothing that actually necessarily incentivizes that. And there's a lot that is a disincentive to doing that. And that's a piece of what adds to the long timelines, because you'll get finally to, you know, far down an NDA path. Again, I'm talking new drugs now, NDA path. And then there's new requirement. I mean, so I think it shouldn't be lost that sometimes we need to preface with, it's 2025, the role of the FDA needs to maintain safety and efficacy, but expand to solving public health problems.
Yeah, I'm totally on board with that and have been my whole career, but it's been an uphill battle often internally, not with all the groups, with some of the groups, you know.
Yeah, I
people-
mean, maybe it's stating the obvious, but I don't think it's obvious to everyone.
I agree. Yeah.
Tanisha, and while we're handing the mic to Tanisha, I just wanted to remind, we do once again have our poll up there for you guys to submit with the recommendations we have. Also, you can plug in if you have thoughts on what Janet has proposed too. Feel free to enter your thoughts in there too, but go ahead, Tanisha.
Janet, we're gonna have to name this concept at some point, but what I would say is what resonates with me about starting this way, it's almost like, what are our most important bellwether cases that we can get in front and start to test sort of a new regulatory approach? And what's appealing too is, for those of us that have been in this drug repurposing space for a very long time, the level of excitement that there is around this area has never been so high. And that, you know, even just working with David, like, we get requests from everybody from Time Magazine to like CBS News. And like, this has gone very mainstream. So if you pick the right bellwether cases where the story is already out there and the data accompanies it, that you can get in front of the agency, then we really have a really unique shot at getting something done that's really different.
Yeah, I just will I totally agree with Amy. And also there's been some, you know, it isn't this regulatory capture that some of the people say, that there's been, because of the user fee programs and all their goals, there's just a tight focus on all that at many of the review groups. And so this would be like something kind of outside of that. That's what Dave was saying, stick it within one of the review processes so that it isn't too foreign to people. But I just feel, you know, I don't think that's necessarily the right thing to do, but you know, it, because, you know, if there's this kind of, we don't want to stay in the same rut, in a sense, we want this to be something different, okay, but good and good for the public. So yeah, we'll see.
I'm really appreciating this challenge for us to think bigger, because I think, you know, we're all kind of trying to, I think this is what we're used to, like working within the bounds already there, but I like that you could challenge us to, you know, think better, like a federal initiative that could be across agencies to work on repurposing, and maybe thinking about different culture shift at FDA and how they think about updating drugs and giving opportunities to other types of interested groups that are gathering research on the use of drugs. So I really appreciate that challenge to think outside our normal boxes and what already exists, and to step outside of that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I'm on the board of a number of nonprofit disease-oriented organizations, and actually some of them have submitted citizen petitions to the agency in the past, asking them to change certain things, certain labels, accelerate certain interventions and so forth. So a lot of groups have taken this into their own hands because it's a gap, as we spent all morning talking about why the regulated industry isn't going to fill this gap, right? So, and that's absolutely true, and that's fine, because they fill other gaps that are important gaps, right? But we really need to think, as this gap is growing, we need to think about what kind of program will actually fill this gap. And it won't just be, it will be nonprofits, but it might be disease-oriented groups with their specific issues that they want to get the agency to address as well.
Well, thank you so much. We are at time. We're going to take another break.
Welcome everybody to our final session, which is the session known as Speak Now or Forever Hold Your Peace. So thank you, everybody. I think I've had the pleasure of getting a chance to meet many of you who are in this room. But for those of you that are not with us in person, I'm Tanisha Carino. I'm a visiting fellow here at Duke Margolis Institute for Health Policy. I joined about 3 years ago when I had a gap in my career and still had a lot of passion for where we go in the area of drug repurposing. And I've had a pretty consistent obsession with drug repurposing, first starting being in a company and understanding that there was so much within a company that we weren't productively being able to move forward for many reasons, a lot of them being resources. And then leading a nonprofit, Faster Cures, where we had for the first time really assembled all of the different non-traditional drug developers to say, what can we do to bring things forward? And then being here at Duke has been such a pleasure because Beth and the team here and Garrett and Mia have really created a body of work and research and momentum to really look at the policy issues. And this is just the latest. And again, thank you to our colleagues at Arnold Ventures for supporting this work. So we've had a wide-ranging discussion about the role of the regulator and whether it is helping identify new opportunities for drug repurposing, which I'm hearing more and more that may not be, where we have real challenges as a community. The second being really around these pathways and how do we think about pathways, particularly if it's non-traditional drug developers that have to sort of go through a pathway that was not necessarily built for them. And then finally, with Janet's very interesting, thought-provoking proposal, like how do we think bigger? You know, and ultimately, we all are intrigued by these stories where there's a drug on a shelf, there's a drug that is available, that it works for something that was never studied for. And when it works for one person and there's this miraculous reaction, it's as scientists and researchers, it's only natural for us to say, how do we get to scale? And that's really the role of policy. So, you know, we've had a lot of discussion. I want to reflect, get you all to reflect, what are things that as we were having this conversation today that occurred to you that we didn't get to, so that we can identify those, dig into them as it relates to this particular focus, which is the role of the regulator, but even invite you to toss out any other questions you may have that you see as a policy question that you have around drug repurposing. So let me pause there and see if I got any early takers on that question. Heather.
Thank you so much. Such a thought-provoking discussion. I think one of the things that I'd really like to better understand and where I think policy can be helpful, or you all especially can be helpful, is in elucidating, you know, who plays what role in all of this. Because, I mean, this is specifically designed about the role of the regulator, but actually many of the things we're talking about are not the role of the regulator, which is fine. And I think that better understanding who needs to be involved in which parts and then, you know, and have responsibility is what's required to help move things forward. Because right now, you know, I think we have a general idea of how, you know, we might spur a new kind of system in place that's very exciting, but somebody has to actually take that initiative, and or multiple somebodies, right? And so figuring out who would have that responsibility and who would be in a position to do that, I think would be really helpful.
Thanks, Heather. You let me know if we have any comments from online, but some of the notes I took from this discussion were the concept of what is responsible promotion. We did not talk about that at all today, but I think that that's an area that has come up a few times. I'm really digging into this idea of product liability. We also heard a lot about, or began to talk about, the role of the payer and what would a payer recognize if we were to do all this, like how could the payer be a force for pulling it through, particularly since non-traditional drug developers still aren't going to have the budgets and the capacity to do the kind of promotion that we all see with like commercial partners, commercial entities. So what could we do to sort of streamline access and reimbursement moving forward? Any other reflections?
Happy to jump in. I appreciate you bringing up the PowerPoint again, because I feel like when we're starting this work, we're so focused on labeling updates for all the kind of obvious reasons about reimbursement, access coverage, et cetera. But, you know, kind of per Janet's thoughts about thinking big and differently, perhaps it's a good opportunity for us, particularly at Margolis, since we have so many relationships with payers, with CMS, with CMMI, et cetera, to revisit what might be possible and, you know, partnering with CMS in addition to this, you know, everything we've kind of talked about today that's so labeling and approval focused.
Great, great. Great, okay. I think that, so in the interest of making sure that we get all of your feedback, I wanted just to also invite you all on Slido to go back to the priorities and the chart that we had up. To the extent that you can give us your last sort of take on what should be the priorities. How should we think about these policy proposals? What is the most, in your mind, the most promising for us to continue to dig in on? If there are any policy proposals that we should modify the way that they're stated in there, please send us your feedback and we'll continue to collect it even after this time. So with that, Beth, come on up for closing.
Thanks, Tanisha. And I think no one is ever upset when we're end a little early, but this has been a really productive conversation. So my main thing up to wrap up today is just give a big thank you to all of our speakers, all of our in-person participants who were active in the discussion, and also everyone who joined us online. This has been really helpful for us as we think through the next steps of this. If you guys have not already seen it, we posted right before this meeting on our event website and also in the final emails. We have a working paper that we published that covers everything we've kind of discussed today too, going deeper into each of those proposals in the framework. And we invite you all to engage with us, to give feedback on that. That's hopefully the starting point of another paper that we'll put out at the end of this year that really kind of gives some proposals of how to move forward in this space. And also, I think we've heard a lot of other ideas of other areas beyond just this role of regulator. And we're always interested in engaging with you on other ideas of where we could put a policy lens or try to bring people together to try to talk through some of these challenges that we've been identifying in this space. And for those of you who are interested, we also are working on our incentive work as well at the University of Chicago. My colleague Sarin is here today, and he is also working with me on that. We'd be happy to talk with you about that more if you're interested. Feel free to reach out, grab me after this. Definitely there's a lot of engagement too and work to be done on the financial incentive side as well. Are there ways that we can get traditional companies involved, or you can find other ways of just funding repurposing studies and creating financial incentives there. So with that, I also want to give a big thank you to our Duke Margolis team. We've had our team of Garrett and Neil Williams, who have been my collaborators through this entire process and would not have gotten here without them. So thank you so much. Also want to thank our events team, Luke DeRocher and Hannah Vitello, who put together a lot of the logistics behind the scene things, the food and the Zoom and everything. So thank you so much. And also thank you to Patrick and Molly for helping us with notes and day of logistics. So thank you so much to everyone. And we'll go ahead and conclude there. Thank you again for joining us today, and please stay in touch.